Hello there. Tonight, we're going to explore what might be the strangest question ever asked. It's a question so simple that a child could ask it, yet so profound that the greatest minds in history have struggled to answer it. The question is this: why does anything exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Take a moment to let that question settle in your mind. It seems almost too big to think about, doesn't it? And yet, here we are, existing, thinking about existence itself. It's rather remarkable when you stop to consider it. This question has been called the fundamental question of metaphysics, the ultimate puzzle, the mystery that sits beneath every other mystery. Because before we can ask about how the universe works, or what consciousness is, or where life came from, we first have to confront this deeper strangeness, the sheer fact that there is a universe at all, that there is anything at all. Think about it. You could imagine a state of absolute nothingness, no space, no time, no matter, no energy, no laws of physics, no possibilities, no potential, just nothing, complete absence. And yet that's not what we have. Instead, we have stars and galaxies, planets and people, thoughts and dreams, mathematics and music. We have something, an entire universe of something, and no one really knows why. The question sounds simple, but the more you examine it, the stranger it becomes. Because what would nothing even look like? Can you picture it? Most people, when they try to imagine nothing, picture empty space, a vast darkness stretching on forever. But that's not really nothing. That's still something. Empty space is still space. It still has dimensions, coordinates, a structure. True nothingness would have no space at all, no dimensions to stretch across, no darkness because darkness requires space to be dark in, no forever because forever is a measure of time, and time wouldn't exist either. Nothingness would be the complete absence of everything, including the framework we use to think about absence itself. And here's what makes it even stranger. Nothing seems like it should be simpler than something. It seems like nothing should be the default state, the natural condition, the way things would be if you didn't add anything. Something seems to require explanation. Something seems to require effort, energy, a cause. Nothing seems to require nothing. It should just be. And yet, somehow, we have all this something instead. Why? What tipped the balance? What broke the symmetry? What caused something to exist when nothing seems so much simpler, so much more probable, so much more natural? Philosophers have been wrestling with this question for thousands of years. The ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides thought deeply about being and non-being, about what it means for something to exist. He argued that non-being cannot be, because if you can think about it or talk about it, then it's something, not nothing. The medieval philosophers debated whether God could create something from nothing, and what that would even mean. The German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz called this the primordial question of metaphysics. He believed there must be a sufficient reason for everything, including existence itself. There must be an answer to why there is something rather than nothing, even if we haven't found it yet. But modern science has approached the question from a different angle. Scientists have discovered that at the quantum level, reality behaves in very strange ways. The vacuum of space, which seems like nothing, is actually seething with activity. Virtual particles pop into existence and vanish again in fractions of a second. The emptiness of space has energy. According to quantum field theory, there's no such thing as true nothingness. Even empty space has quantum fields permeating it, fluctuating, creating temporary particles, humming with potential. Some physicists have suggested that the universe itself might have emerged from a quantum fluctuation, that nothing is actually unstable, that given enough time, or perhaps no time at all, something will spontaneously emerge from nothing simply because the laws of quantum mechanics allow it. Lawrence Krauss, a theoretical physicist, wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, in which he argues that the laws of physics naturally lead to the creation of universes from empty space. He suggests that nothing is unstable and something is inevitable. But critics pointed out a problem with this argument. The quantum fields, the laws of physics, the mathematical structures that Krauss relies on, these are all something. They're not nothing. So he hasn't really explained why there's something rather than nothing. He's explained how one kind of something can turn into another kind of something. The deeper question remains, and this is where we start to see how slippery the question really is. What counts as nothing? If you have laws of physics but no matter, is that nothing? If you have mathematical truths but no physical universe, is that nothing? If you have pure potentiality but no actuality, is that nothing? Different philosophers and scientists define nothing differently, and so they arrive at different answers, or different versions of the same puzzlement. Some thinkers have suggested that the question itself might be flawed. They argue that asking why there is something rather than nothing assumes that nothing is a real possibility, a real alternative to what we have. But maybe it isn't. Maybe existence is necessary. Maybe something has to exist, and nothingness is actually impossible. This is the approach taken by those who believe in what philosophers call a necessary being, something that exists by its own nature, something that cannot not exist. For many religious thinkers, this necessary being is God. God exists because existence is part of God's very essence. God is the foundation, the ground of being, the reason there is something rather than nothing. But this just pushes the question back a step. Why is there a necessary being? Why is there something whose nature is to exist? Why isn't there just nothing, including no necessary beings? The philosopher David Hume pointed out that we can imagine the non-existence of anything. There's no logical contradiction in imagining that God doesn't exist, or that the universe doesn't exist, or that you don't exist. So how can anything be truly necessary? How can anything exist in such a way that its non-existence is impossible? Some philosophers have responded by distinguishing between logical necessity and metaphysical necessity. Something might be logically possible to imagine not existing, but metaphysically necessary in the sense that it's the foundation of all reality. It's the thing that has to exist in order for anything else to exist. It's the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the ground of being. But even this distinction doesn't fully resolve the puzzle. It still leaves us wondering why there should be any ground of being at all. Why should reality have a foundation? Why couldn't there just be nothing, no foundation, no ground, no being? Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're trying to explain why a particular thing exists. You point to its cause. The tree exists because a seed was planted. The seed exists because a previous tree produced it. That tree exists because of an earlier seed, and so on. You can trace this chain of causes back and back and back. But where does the chain end? Does it go back forever, an infinite regress of causes stretching back into the past with no beginning? Or does it end somewhere, with a first cause, something that exists without being caused by anything else? Both options seem problematic. An infinite regress seems to explain nothing, its causes all the way down, with no ultimate foundation. But a first cause seems arbitrary. Why should that particular thing get to exist without a cause, when everything else needs a cause? Aristotle tried to solve this problem by proposing an unmoved mover, a first cause that is pure actuality, pure existence, with no potential to be anything other than what it is. This unmoved mover doesn't need a cause, because it's not the kind of thing that could have been different. It exists necessarily. It's the explanation for everything else, but it doesn't need an explanation itself, because explanation only makes sense for things that could have been otherwise. If something couldn't have been otherwise, if it exists necessarily, then asking why it exists is like asking why 2 + 2 = 4. It just does. That's its nature. But again, we can wonder, why is there anything with that nature? Why is there anything that exists necessarily? Why is there pure actuality? Why isn't there just nothing, with no actuality, no potential, no nature, no being? The question seems to persist no matter how we try to answer it. It's like a horizon that recedes as we approach it. Every answer we give just reveals another version of the same question lurking beneath. Some philosophers have suggested that maybe the question has no answer. not because we're not smart enough to find the answer, but because the question doesn't make sense. It's like asking what's north of the North Pole. The question seems grammatically correct, but it's actually meaningless because the concepts it uses don't apply. The North Pole is the northernmost point. There's nothing north of it. The question assumes a framework that doesn't work. Similarly, asking why there is something rather than nothing might assume a framework that doesn't apply to existence as a whole. It assumes that existence itself is the kind of thing that could have a cause or a reason. But maybe it isn't. Maybe existence is just the basic fact, the starting point, the thing that doesn't have a why, because it's the foundation for all whys. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein famously said that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. He believed that some questions push language beyond its limits, into territory where words stop meaning anything clear. Maybe the question of why there is something rather than nothing is one of those questions. Maybe it's the ultimate limit of human understanding, the edge of what our minds can grasp. We can feel the strangeness of existence, we can sense the mystery, but we can't quite put it into words or thoughts that fully capture what we're trying to ask. And yet, the question persists. It haunts us. Every thoughtful person eventually confronts it in some form, usually late at night, staring at the ceiling, or gazing at the stars, or sitting quietly alone. The universe suddenly seems astonishingly improbable. You become acutely aware that you exist, that anything exists, and the sheer strangeness of that fact washes over you. Why is there all this? Why am I here to wonder about it? Why isn't there just eternal, peaceful, simple nothingness? Scientists have discovered that the universe began with a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago. Before that moment, all the matter and energy and space and time were compressed into an infinitesimally small point. And then, for reasons no one fully understands, it exploded outward, expanding and cooling, forming particles and atoms and eventually stars and galaxies and planets and life. But this raises an obvious question. What caused the Big Bang? What existed before it? What lit the fuse? Some cosmologists suggest that time itself began with the Big Bang. So asking what came before is like asking what's north of the North Pole. There was no before. Time didn't exist yet. The Big Bang wasn't an event in time. It was the beginning of time itself. But this seems to just reformulate the question rather than answer it. Fine. Time began with the Big Bang. But why did time begin at all? Why was there a Big Bang rather than no Big Bang? Why was there the potential for time to begin? Why were there laws of physics that allowed for a Big Bang? Where did those laws come from? Some physicists have proposed that our universe is just one of countless universes, all bubbling into existence in an eternal process of cosmic inflation. New universes are constantly being born from quantum fluctuations, each with its own laws of physics, its own values for fundamental constants, its own history. We happen to live in one that has the right conditions for life, which is why we're here to wonder about it. But this multiverse hypothesis doesn't answer the fundamental question either. It just expands the scope. Now we're asking why there's a multiverse rather than no multiverse, why there are laws that govern the creation of universes, why there's this vast cosmic process rather than just nothing. Every scientific answer seems to point toward deeper questions. Science is extraordinarily good at explaining how things work, how one thing leads to another, how systems evolve and change and produce complexity. But when we press science to answer why there is anything at all, it struggles. Because science operates within the universe, using the laws of the universe to explain phenomena in the universe, it's not clear that scientific methods can reach outside the universe to explain the universe itself. It's like trying to use a ruler to measure the ruler. You need something outside the system to fully explain the system. This is why many thinkers have concluded that the answer to why there is something rather than nothing must be metaphysical or theological rather than scientific. It must involve categories that transcend the physical universe. Categories like necessary existence, or ground of being, or ultimate reality, or God. But as we've seen, These metaphysical answers come with their own puzzles and problems. They offer a different kind of explanation, but they don't fully dissolve the mystery. They don't make the strangeness go away. Perhaps that's because the strangeness is fundamental. Perhaps existence itself is the ultimate brute fact, the thing that simply is, without explanation, without cause, without reason. Perhaps at the bottom of all our whys, there's just an is. Reality exists because it does. There's something rather than nothing because there is. No deeper answer is available because there is no deeper level to appeal to. This is sometimes called metaphysical nihilism, though that's a bit of a misleading term. It doesn't mean that nothing matters or that life is meaningless. It just means that at the most fundamental level, existence has no explanation. It's the unexplained explainer, the unjustified justification, the uncaused cause of everything else. But accepting this feels unsatisfying, doesn't it? Our minds rebel against brute facts. We want reasons, causes, explanations. We want to understand. The idea that existence itself is just a given, something we have to accept without understanding, feels like giving up, like abandoning the question rather than answering it. And yet, maybe that's the most honest response. Maybe the question of why there is something rather than nothing is the one question that can't have an answer, because any answer we give would itself be something, and then we'd have to ask why that answer exists. We'd be trapped in an infinite regress of explanations, each one pushing the mystery back but never eliminating it. Some mystics and spiritual teachers have suggested that the question dissolves when you see reality from a different perspective. From the ordinary perspective, there's a sharp distinction between something and nothing, between existence and non-existence. But from a deeper perspective, that distinction might be illusory. Buddhist philosophy, for example, often speaks of emptiness, but emptiness in Buddhism doesn't mean nothingness. It means that things don't have independent, intrinsic existence. Everything is interconnected, interdependent, empty of separate selfhood. From this view, the question of why there's something rather than nothing assumes a false framework. It assumes that something and nothing are absolute opposites, when really they might be two sides of the same coin, two ways of looking at the same reality. Similarly, some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that the universe exists in a superposition of all possible states until it's observed, at which point it collapses into one particular state. In this view, reality is fundamentally about possibilities and probabilities, not concrete things. And if reality is made of possibilities rather than things, then the line between something and nothing becomes blurry. A possibility isn't quite something, but it isn't quite nothing either. It's a potential something, hovering between being and non-being. Maybe the universe exists in that liminal space, neither fully something nor fully nothing, but a shimmering field of potential constantly collapsing into actuality and then dissolving back into possibility again. These ideas are hard to wrap your mind around. They push language and thought to their limits. But that's fitting for this question. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is the limit question, the boundary of what we can meaningfully ask. It stands at the edge of all our thinking, pointing towards something beyond thought, beyond words, beyond the categories we use to make sense of reality. And perhaps that's where we have to leave it, at least for now. Not with an answer, but with a deepened sense of mystery, a renewed appreciation for the strangeness and wonder of existence itself. Because the truth is, we are here. You are here, listening to these words, thinking these thoughts, existing in this moment. And that is astonishing. Whatever the reason, whatever the cause, whatever the ultimate explanation or lack thereof, the fact remains that you exist. The universe exists. There is something rather than nothing. And that something includes your consciousness, your awareness, your ability to wonder about all this. In a way, the universe is looking at itself through your eyes, asking itself why it exists. And maybe that capacity for wonder, that ability to ask the question even if we can't answer it, maybe that's part of what makes existence worthwhile. Maybe the mystery is the point. Let's think about time for a moment, because time is deeply connected to this question of why anything exists. We usually think of causes happening before their effects. The seed comes before the tree. The Big Bang comes before galaxies. One thing leads to another in a sequence, a chain of events unfolding through time. But what if time itself is part of what needs explaining? What if time isn't the stage on which existence plays out, but rather one of the actors, one of the things that exists and needs a reason for existing? This is where things get truly mind-bending. Because if time itself had a beginning, then what does it mean to ask what caused that beginning? Causes happen in time. Something happens, and then, later, its effect happens. But if time itself is beginning, there is no before. There is no earlier moment when the cause could have occurred. The very concept of causation seems to break down. Some physicists and philosophers have tried to get around this problem by imagining a timeless state from which time emerged. A state of pure mathematics, perhaps, or pure quantum probability, existing outside of time, not changing, not evolving, just eternally being what it is. And then, somehow, time branches off from this timeless foundation. But even this picture raises questions. How does something timeless give rise to something temporal? How does change emerge from changelessness? How does becoming arise from pure being? These questions don't have easy answers. They might not have answers at all. But they point to something important. They point to the fact that our ordinary concepts, the concepts we use to navigate everyday life, start to fail us when we try to think about the ultimate nature of reality. We think in terms of things and causes, events and sequences, objects moving through space and time. But maybe reality at its deepest level isn't like that. Maybe it's something our minds can't quite grasp, because our minds evolved to deal with medium-sized objects at human timescales, not with the foundations of existence itself. We're asking a question that might require a kind of thinking we're not equipped for. Like asking a fish to understand what it's like to breathe air. The fish can try, can use its fish concepts and fish experiences to imagine something beyond water, but there's a fundamental limitation. It lacks the framework. And we might lack the framework to truly understand why there is something rather than nothing. But let's keep trying anyway. Let's explore more perspectives, more angles, more ways of approaching this ultimate puzzle. One interesting approach comes from mathematics. Mathematics seems to exist in a strange way. Mathematical truths appear to be true regardless of whether anyone discovers them or thinks about them. 2 + 2 = 4 before humans existed. The Pythagorean theorem was true before Pythagoras proved it. Pi had the same value billions of years ago as it does today. Mathematical truths seem eternal, unchanging, necessary. They don't depend on the physical universe. Even if the entire universe disappeared, 2 + 2 would still equal 4. This has led some philosophers to argue that mathematical truths exist in a realm of their own, a Platonic realm of abstract objects that exists necessarily, outside of space and time. If mathematical truths exist necessarily, then perhaps they can serve as the foundation for everything else. Perhaps the universe exists because it's a mathematical structure, and mathematical structures exist necessarily. This is the view defended by physicist Max Tegmark in his mathematical universe hypothesis. He suggests that physical reality is a mathematical structure, and all possible mathematical structures exist in some sense, forming a vast multiverse of mathematical realities. We live in one particular mathematical structure, one that happens to have the right properties to support conscious observers like us. But the mathematical realm as a whole exists necessarily. It couldn't not exist because mathematical truths are necessary truths. And if mathematical structures exist necessarily, then asking why there's something rather than nothing is answered. There's something because mathematical existence is necessary, and physical existence is just mathematical existence viewed from the inside. But this view has its critics. Many philosophers argue that mathematical objects aren't really things that exist in any meaningful sense. They're abstractions, concepts, patterns that we notice and name. They don't exist in the way that a chair exists or a star exists. You can't bump into a number. You can't find the square root of 2 floating in space somewhere. Mathematical truths might be true, necessarily true even, but that doesn't mean they're things that exist. There's a difference between truth and existence. The statement 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true, but that doesn't mean the number 4 exists as an entity somewhere. It just means that the pattern we call 4 has certain logical relationships to the pattern we call 2. And even if we grant that mathematical objects exist in some abstract sense, it's not clear that this solves the mystery. We're still left wondering why there's a realm of mathematical truth rather than no such realm. Why are there these patterns, these structures, these logical necessities? Why isn't there just absolutely nothing, including no mathematical truths, no logical laws, no abstract realm? The mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell once said that mathematics is the subject in which we never know what we're talking about or whether what we're saying is true. He meant this as a comment on the abstract nature of mathematics, but it also hints at the deeper puzzle. Mathematics gives us powerful tools for describing reality, but it doesn't obviously explain why reality is there to be described in the first place. Let's shift our focus to consciousness for a moment, because there's something particularly puzzling about the existence of consciousness. It's one thing to wonder why there are physical objects, stars and planets and atoms, but it's another thing entirely to wonder why there are subjects, beings who experience, who feel, who are aware. You are not just a collection of particles obeying physical laws. You are a perspective, a point of view, a someone, rather than just a something. You have inner experiences, sensations, thoughts, emotions. There's something it's like to be you. And this subjective dimension of reality seems especially mysterious. Why should the universe contain not just objects but also subjects? Why should matter give rise to minds? Why should there be anyone home, so to speak, to witness existence? Some philosophers have argued that consciousness is actually fundamental to reality, not something that emerges from unconscious matter, but something that's woven into the fabric of existence itself. This view, called panpsychism, suggests that even the simplest particles have some rudimentary form of consciousness or experience. And as matter becomes more complex and organized, consciousness becomes richer and more sophisticated, eventually giving rise to human awareness. If consciousness is fundamental, then maybe it's part of the answer to why there's something rather than nothing. Maybe the universe exists because existence itself is a form of experience. Reality is what it's like to be the cosmos. The universe is the content of a vast cosmic consciousness, and we are localized perspectives within that consciousness, temporary eddies in the stream of cosmic awareness. This is a beautiful idea, and it has roots in many mystical and spiritual traditions. Hinduism speaks of Brahman, the ultimate reality that is pure consciousness. Everything that exists is a manifestation of Brahman, a play of consciousness creating the illusion of separate objects and separate selves. Buddhism speaks of Buddha nature, the awareness that underlies all phenomena. Certain interpretations of quantum mechanics even suggest that consciousness plays a role in bringing reality into being, that the act of observation collapses the wave function and turns possibilities into actualities. Without observers, without consciousness, maybe there would just be an undefined haze of quantum possibilities, never crystallizing into actual events. In this view, consciousness doesn't just witness existence, it participates in creating it. But even if consciousness is fundamental, we're still left with questions. Why is there consciousness rather than no consciousness? Why is there experience rather than no experience? Why is there this cosmic awareness rather than just eternal unconscious nothingness? The mystery doesn't go away, it just takes a different form. And some philosophers argue that making consciousness fundamental creates more problems than it solves. We have some understanding of how unconscious particles and forces can combine to create complex structures. We have chemistry and biology and neuroscience to explain how brains work. But if we start with consciousness as fundamental, it's much harder to explain why it produces the specific patterns we observe. Why would cosmic consciousness manifest as quarks and electrons? Why would it create a universe with these particular laws of physics? The explanatory power seems to run in the wrong direction. Here's another angle to consider. Some thinkers have suggested that nothingness is actually impossible, that the very concept is incoherent, because to have nothingness, you need the absence of everything. But absence is itself a kind of something. It's a state, a condition, a way things are. And if there's a way things are, then there's something rather than nothing. The philosopher Parmenides made an argument like this in ancient Greece. He said that non-being cannot be because you cannot think or speak about what is not. The moment you conceive of nothingness, you've made it into a something, a concept, an idea. Therefore, only being exists. Non-being is impossible. What exists must exist, and what doesn't exist cannot even be discussed coherently. This argument has a certain logical appeal, but it also seems like a trick of language. Surely we can imagine a state where nothing exists. We can conceive of it even if we can't fully visualize it. We can say there could have been nothing, and that sentence seems meaningful. So maybe Parmenides was wrong. Maybe non-being is possible, even if it's hard to think about clearly. Or maybe Parmenides was gesturing towards something true, but expressing it in a confusing way. Maybe the point is that existence is the default, the natural state, the thing that doesn't need explaining, because non-existence would actually require an explanation. Existence is simple. It just is. Nothingness would be a special condition, a deprivation, a removal of what naturally is there. So we shouldn't be asking why there's something. We should be grateful that the natural state of affairs is being rather than non-being. But this feels like it's assuming what we're trying to explain. Why should existence be the default? Why should being be more natural than non-being? To our intuitions, nothingness seems simpler. It seems like the zero state, the baseline, the absence of complication. Something seems like it requires addition, creation, effort. But maybe our intuitions are wrong. Maybe existence is actually simpler than non-existence. Maybe being is the ground state of reality, and nothingness would require a strange and improbable configuration, a perfect cancellation of everything that naturally tends to exist. This is hard to wrap your mind around because it inverts our usual assumptions. But perhaps those assumptions are just products of our limited perspective. Let's think about possibility for a moment. Before anything existed, was it possible for something to exist? If yes, then possibility itself existed. And if possibility existed, then there was already something rather than nothing. Possibility is a kind of something. It's a structure, a space of potential outcomes, a framework within which some things can happen and other things cannot. So if it was possible for the universe to exist, then even before the universe existed, there was this space of possibilities. And we're back to asking why there's that rather than nothing. On the other hand, if it was not possible for anything to exist, then nothing would exist, and we wouldn't be here to wonder about it. So the fact that we're here asking the question suggests that existence was possible. And if existence was possible, then possibility existed. And if possibility existed, there was never truly nothing. This is a strange loop of reasoning. It suggests that the question of why there's something rather than nothing might contain its own answer. The fact that we can ask the question implies that existence is possible. And if existence is possible, then possibility exists. And if possibility exists, then there's something. So there's something because there's something. The question answers itself in a circular way that's either deeply profound or completely empty, depending on how you look at it. Philosophers have debated this for centuries. Some see it as a genuine insight into the nature of reality. Others see it as wordplay that doesn't actually explain anything. The truth might be somewhere in between. It might point to the limits of explanation, the point where our conceptual tools give out and we're left with brute facts that can't be reduced any further. Consider the principle of sufficient reason. This is the idea that everything has a reason or explanation for why it is the way it is. Leibniz was a strong advocate of this principle. He believed that for every fact there must be an explanation. If there's a chair in the room, there's a reason why. Someone put it there. If the sky is blue, there's a reason why. It has to do with the way light scatters in the atmosphere. No facts are just random or arbitrary. Everything has sufficient reason for being as it is. But if we apply this principle to existence as a whole, we get into trouble. If there's something rather than nothing, there must be a reason why. But what could that reason be? The reason itself would have to exist. And then we'd need a reason for that reason. And so on, infinitely. We never reach a final explanation that doesn't itself require explanation. Leibniz tried to solve this problem by pointing to God as a necessary being, a being whose reason for existing is contained within itself. God exists because existence is part of God's essence. God is the sufficient reason for everything else, and God's own sufficient reason is God's nature. But as we've already seen, this pushes the question back. Why is there a being with that nature? Why is there something whose essence includes existence? The principle of sufficient reason seems to lead us into an infinite regress or to a brute fact that has no explanation. Either way, it doesn't fully resolve the mystery. Some philosophers have responded by rejecting the principle of sufficient reason, at least in its strongest form. They argue that not everything needs an explanation. Some facts are just basic, fundamental, brute, and the fact that there's something rather than nothing might be one of those brute facts. It's the stopping point of explanation. We can explain many things within the universe by pointing to causes and reasons. But the universe as a whole, the fact of existence itself, doesn't have an explanation. It's the unexplained foundation upon which all explanations rest. This might seem unsatisfying, but it might also be unavoidable. Explanation has to stop somewhere. You can't have explanations all the way down. At some point you reach bedrock, the basic facts that simply are what they are. And maybe the existence of something rather than nothing is that bedrock. It's not that we've failed to find the explanation, it's that there is no explanation to find. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, is like asking why is red red. It's a category mistake. Red is red because that's what red is. Existence exists because that's what existence does. The answer is contained in the question. But even if we accept that some things have no explanation, it still feels strange that this would be one of them. The existence of everything seems like it should have an explanation if anything does. It seems too important, too fundamental, too consequential to be a brute fact. And yet, maybe that's exactly why it has to be a brute fact. Because it's so fundamental, there's nothing more fundamental to explain it in terms of. It's the foundation of the foundation, the ground of the ground, the reason behind all reasons that itself has no reason. This is philosophically frustrating, but it might be the truth. Reality might not be as neat and tidy as we'd like it to be. The ultimate answer to the ultimate question might be that there is no answer. Let's consider the anthropic principle. This is the observation that the universe must be compatible with the existence of observers, because we are observers and we exist in this universe. If the universe didn't have the right properties for life and consciousness to emerge, we wouldn't be here to wonder about it. So in some sense, the universe must be the way it is, because otherwise we couldn't ask why it is the way it is. The anthropic principle comes in different strengths. The weak anthropic principle just notes that we shouldn't be surprised that we find ourselves in a universe capable of supporting life. That's a selection effect. We could only ever find ourselves in such a universe. The strong anthropic principle suggests something more radical, that the universe must have properties compatible with life emerging at some point, that our existence somehow constrains or determines the nature of reality. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics take this even further. They suggest that observation plays a fundamental role in bringing reality into existence. The universe exists in a superposition of all possible states until it's observed, at which point it collapses into one particular state. Before observers existed, the universe was in some sense not fully real, not fully determinate. It became real through the process of being observed. This participatory anthropic principle suggests that we're not just passive witnesses to existence, we're active participants in creating it. The universe exists because we observe it, and we exist because the universe has properties that allow observers to emerge. It's a strange loop, a self-creating, self-observing system with no external foundation. These ideas are controversial and speculative. Most physicists don't interpret quantum mechanics this way, but they point to something interesting. They suggest that the question of why there's something rather than nothing might be intimately connected to the question of why there's consciousness, why there are observers. Maybe these aren't two separate questions, but two aspects of the same deep mystery. Existence and awareness might be two sides of the same coin. Reality exists because it's experienced, and it's experienced because it exists. The universe is a self-witnessing process, and we are localized instances of that witnessing. This doesn't answer the question, but it reframes it in an interesting way. It suggests that subject and object, observer and observed, consciousness and world are not separate things that happen to come together. They're intrinsically linked aspects of a unified reality. Now let's explore some of the scientific theories that try to grapple with this question of origins, of why there is something rather than nothing. We've touched on some of these already, but let's go deeper, because modern cosmology has uncovered some truly astonishing possibilities about the nature of existence. The Big Bang theory tells us that the universe began in an incredibly hot, dense state about 13.8 billion years ago and has been expanding and cooling ever since. But what triggered the Big Bang? What set it in motion? For a long time, this question seemed unanswerable, perhaps even unaskable. The Big Bang marked the beginning of time itself, so there was no before in which a cause could operate. Asking what came before the Big Bang was like asking what's north of the North Pole, a question that sounds meaningful but actually isn't because it misapplies spatial or temporal concepts beyond their domain of validity. But physicists are remarkably creative at finding ways to think about seemingly unthinkable questions. One proposal, developed by Stephen Hawking and James Hartle, is called the no-boundary proposal. It suggests that if we go back far enough in time, approaching the Big Bang, time itself becomes increasingly spatial. Near the very beginning, the distinction between time and space blurs and eventually disappears. The universe doesn't have a sharp beginning point in time because time smoothly transitions into space. It's like asking where the surface of the Earth begins. The Earth doesn't have an edge. If you walk south, you eventually reach the South Pole, but you don't fall off, you just curve around and start heading north again. Similarly, the universe doesn't have a beginning in the sense of a first moment. It curves back on itself in a four-dimensional way that's hard to visualize but mathematically consistent. In this model, asking what caused the Big Bang becomes meaningless because there's no edge, no boundary, no beginning that needs a cause. The universe is finite but unbounded, complete in itself, requiring no external explanation. This is an elegant idea, but it's also deeply counterintuitive. It requires us to imagine that time isn't what we think it is, that near the beginning of the universe, the dimension we experience as time was actually more like a dimension of space. And even if we accept this, we might still wonder why there's this particular four-dimensional structure rather than no structure at all. The no-boundary proposal explains how the universe could exist without a cause, but it doesn't explain why there's a universe for the proposal to apply to. It's a how without a why, which is typical of scientific explanations. Science is very good at describing processes, at showing how one state leads to another, at mapping the structure of reality. But when we push it to the ultimate question, when we ask not how but why, science tends to reach its limits and gesture toward philosophy or metaphysics or simply mystery. Another fascinating idea from modern cosmology is eternal inflation. This is the theory that our universe, our Big Bang, is just one bubble in an eternally inflating multiverse. According to this model, there's a field called the inflaton field that pervades reality. In most of this field, space is expanding exponentially fast, doubling in size every tiny fraction of a second. This exponential expansion is called inflation. But occasionally, in small regions, the inflaton field decays, inflation stops, and that energy gets converted into matter and radiation. That's what we call a Big Bang. Our entire observable universe is one such region where inflation stopped. But beyond our bubble, inflation continues, and other bubbles are constantly forming, each one a separate universe with its own Big Bang, potentially with its own laws of physics, its own values for fundamental constants, its own history. In eternal inflation, there was no first universe. The process has been going on forever into the past and will continue forever into the future. New universes are always being born from the inflating background. This solves the problem of what caused our Big Bang by saying it didn't need a unique cause. It was just a natural fluctuation in an eternal process. But of course, this just shifts the question. Why is there an eternally inflating multiverse rather than nothing? Why is there an inflaton field? Why are there quantum fluctuations that create universes? Where did the laws of physics that govern this process come from? Eternal inflation is a remarkable scientific theory, well grounded in our understanding of quantum fields and general relativity. But it doesn't answer the fundamental question. It replaces one mystery with another, trading the question of why there's a universe for the question of why there's a multiverse. And yet, there's something appealing about eternal inflation precisely because it eliminates the need for a beginning. One of the puzzling things about existence is that it seems like it must have started somewhere, and starting points raise questions about what came before and what triggered the start. But if the multiverse has always existed, eternally producing new universes, then there's no starting point to explain. Existence has just always been doing its thing, inflating and bubbling and creating, with no first moment, no initial cause, no origin story. It's existence without beginning, which in some ways is easier to accept than existence with a beginning, because beginnings demand explanations and eternal processes don't. They just are, always have been, always will be. The mystery shifts from why did it start to why has it always been going. But perhaps that's progress. Perhaps an eternal process is less puzzling than a first moment. Some cosmologists have taken this idea even further. Alexander Vilenkin, one of the pioneers of eternal inflation, has argued that even eternal inflation must have had a beginning. He uses mathematical theorems to show that the inflating region of the multiverse cannot be eternal into the past. There must have been a boundary, a starting point. The multiverse, like our universe, must have come into existence at some finite time in the past. Other cosmologists disagree. They propose modifications to the theory, different boundary conditions, different interpretations of time that allow for a truly eternal multiverse with no beginning. The debate is technical and ongoing, and it's not clear whether it can ever be fully resolved, because we're talking about regions of space-time that are forever beyond our observational reach. We can't see beyond our own bubble universe. We can't gather data about the multiverse as a whole. We're limited to indirect evidence and mathematical consistency arguments. This is a strange position to be in. Science has always progressed by making observations, testing predictions, refining theories based on evidence. But when we ask about the ultimate origin of everything, we're asking about something that might be in principle unobservable. The other universes in the multiverse, if they exist, are causally disconnected from us. No signal from them can ever reach us. No experiment we perform can detect them. We can infer their existence from the mathematics of inflation and quantum mechanics, but we can't confirm it empirically. This makes some scientists uncomfortable. It starts to feel less like science and more like metaphysics, a realm where evidence is sparse and arguments are philosophical. But perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps when we push to the boundaries of existence, we inevitably cross over from science into philosophy, from observation into speculation, from what we can test to what we can only imagine. Let's talk about quantum mechanics for a moment, because quantum mechanics has some very strange things to say about existence. At the quantum level, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. An electron doesn't have a definite position or momentum. It exists in a superposition of all possible positions and momenta simultaneously. Only when you measure it does it collapse into one specific state. Before measurement, it's not that we don't know where the electron is. It's that the electron doesn't have a definite location. It's smeared out across space in a wave of probability. This is deeply weird. It suggests that reality at the fundamental level is indeterminate, fuzzy, not quite fully real until observation brings it into focus. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics take this even further. The many worlds interpretation says that when a quantum system is measured, the universe splits into multiple branches, one for each possible outcome. In one branch, the electron is here. In another branch, it's there. Both branches are equally real. They just can't interact with each other. Every quantum measurement creates a branching of reality into parallel worlds. If many worlds is true, and it's a genuinely respectable interpretation held by many physicists, then existence is vastly more abundant than we thought. There's not just this universe, but countless parallel universes, constantly branching off from each other with every quantum event. And quantum events are happening everywhere, all the time, at the microscopic level. Every particle interaction, every atomic decay, every photon absorption creates a branching. The multiverse of many worlds is unimaginably vast, a tree of possibilities that branches exponentially with every passing moment. In this picture, existence is not sparse, but exuberantly prolific. Reality doesn't just create one outcome, it creates all possible outcomes, all living side by side in parallel branches of the wave function. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because quantum mechanics doesn't just create something, it creates everything, all possible somethings, an infinite profusion of parallel realities exploring every possibility. But again, this doesn't really answer the fundamental question. It just makes existence bigger. Why is there a quantum mechanical multiverse rather than nothing? Why are there wave functions that branch? Why are there quantum fields obeying these particular equations? The mystery persists, expanded, but not dissolved. Some physicists have suggested that the laws of quantum mechanics themselves might emerge from something even more fundamental. Maybe there's a deeper level of reality, a quantum gravity theory, or a theory of everything that unifies all the forces and explains where the laws come from. String theory is one candidate for such a theory. It proposes that the fundamental constituents of reality are not particles, but tiny vibrating strings. Different vibration patterns of these strings give rise to different particles, electrons and quarks and photons, all emerging from the same underlying stringy substrate. String theory is mathematically beautiful and has the potential to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, the two great pillars of modern physics that currently don't fit together. But string theory has a problem. It's not just one theory, it's a vast landscape of possible theories. Depending on how you configure the extra dimensions that string theory requires, you get different effective laws of physics, different particles, different forces, different values for the constants of nature. There might be 10 to the 500th power or more different possible string theory configurations, each one representing a different possible universe. This string theory landscape connects to eternal inflation in an interesting way. Maybe all these possible string theory universes actually exist as different bubble universes in the eternally inflating multiverse. Each bubble has a different configuration, a different set of laws. Our universe has the particular laws we observe because we happen to be in this particular bubble, but there are countless other bubbles with different laws. This leads to a principle called the anthropic principle, which we touched on earlier. If there are countless universes with different laws, then we shouldn't be surprised that we find ourselves in one with laws compatible with life. Most universes might be sterile, devoid of complexity, unable to produce stars or planets or chemistry or biology. But we could only ever find ourselves in one of the rare universes where life is possible, because that's where observers like us can exist. So the question of why our universe has these specific laws gets answered by statistics and selection bias. It's not that our universe is special, it's that we're selected to observe a universe like this one. The vast majority of universes go unobserved because there's no one there to observe them. This is a probabilistic answer rather than a causal one. It doesn't explain why the multiverse exists, but it explains why we experience the particular slice of it that we do. Some people find this deeply unsatisfying. It feels like giving up on the search for a deeper explanation. Instead of finding a reason why the laws of physics are what they are, we're saying it's just random, just luck, just the fact that we happen to be in one of the universes where things worked out. But others find it liberating. It means we don't need a fine-tuned universe designed specifically for us. We don't need to invoke a creator who carefully adjusted the constants to make life possible. We just need a vast enough multiverse that somewhere, by pure chance, the right conditions arise. And then observers evolve in those places and wonder why their universe is so perfect for them, not realizing that they're observing a selection effect, not a design. But let's step back from the multiverse for a moment and think about the nature of physical laws themselves. Where do the laws of physics come from? Why does nature obey these particular mathematical equations? Why is there gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces? Why do particles have the masses they have, the charges they have, the interaction strengths they have? Physics can describe how these laws work, can write down the equations, can predict what will happen in different circumstances. But physics doesn't explain why these laws rather than other laws, or why there are laws at all rather than just chaos and randomness. Some philosophers and physicists have suggested that maybe the laws of physics aren't external constraints imposed on reality. Maybe they're more like descriptions of the way reality naturally organizes itself. Maybe there's only one way for a universe to be logically consistent, and the laws we observe are simply the requirements of that consistency. This is related to an idea in mathematics called mathematical Platonism, the view that mathematical truths exist necessarily, independent of physical reality. 2 + 2 = 4 in all possible worlds. The structure of logic, the relationships between numbers, the theorems of geometry, all of these are necessary truths that couldn't be otherwise. Some thinkers have proposed that physical laws might be similar. Maybe there's only one logically consistent set of laws that allows for a stable, coherent universe. The laws of physics we observe aren't arbitrary. They're the necessary structure of any possible reality. If this is true, then the question of why these laws becomes easier to answer. They're the only laws there could be. They're necessary in the same way that mathematical truths are necessary. And if the laws are necessary, then perhaps existence itself is necessary. Perhaps a universe obeying these laws must exist because the alternative, non-existence, is incoherent or impossible or less fundamental than existence. But this is a big if, and most physicists doubt that it's true. The laws of physics don't seem necessary in the way that mathematical truths are. We can easily imagine different laws, different values for the constants, different numbers of dimensions, different particles and forces. None of these alternatives seem logically contradictory. They're just different possible ways for a universe to be. So it's hard to see why our particular laws would be necessary. More likely, there are many possible sets of laws, and the question becomes why these rather than those. And if there are many possible sets, then maybe they're all realized in some multiverse somewhere, or maybe there's a deeper explanation we haven't found yet, or maybe it's just a brute fact that this is the way our universe is. Let's think about causation again, because causation is central to how we think about explanation. When we ask why something exists, we're usually asking for its cause. What brought it into being? What made it happen? But causation is a slippery concept. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, pointed out that we never actually observe causation directly. We observe that one event follows another. The cue ball strikes the 8-ball, and then the 8-ball moves. But we don't see the causation itself, the mysterious power or force that makes the second event follow the first. We just see a regular pattern. One thing happens, then another thing happens. We infer causation, but we don't perceive it. Maybe causation is just regularity, just the fact that certain patterns repeat. The universe has regularities, laws that describe how events unfold, and we call these causal laws. But there might not be anything more to causation than that, just patterns in the succession of events. If Hume is right, then asking for the cause of the universe might be a mistake. Causation is a pattern within the universe, a relationship between events in space and time. But the universe as a whole isn't an event within space and time. It's the totality of space and time. So applying the concept of causation to the universe itself might be like trying to use a hammer to hammer itself. The tool doesn't work when applied to itself. Causation explains things within the universe, but it can't explain the universe itself because the universe isn't the kind of thing that can have a cause. It's not an event. It's the framework within which events happen. This is a conceptual point, not an empirical one. It's about the limits of how we can meaningfully apply our concepts. And if it's right, then the question of what caused existence is based on a category error. Existence doesn't have a cause because causation only makes sense for things within existence, not for existence as a whole. But many philosophers reject this line of argument. They think causation can be applied more broadly, that we can meaningfully ask about the cause of the universe, or the cause of existence itself. And if we can ask the question, then presumably there's an answer, even if we don't know what it is. This brings us back to the idea of a necessary being, something that exists without a cause, because its nature is such that it must exist. For theistic philosophers, this necessary being is God. God is not an event in time, so God doesn't need a cause. God is eternal, existing outside of time, or perhaps as the ground of time itself. God's existence is necessary, not contingent. God cannot not exist. And God is the cause of everything else, the creator who brought the universe into being, not through a process in time, but through an eternal act of will, or an eternal emanation of being. This is a venerable answer, endorsed by countless theologians and philosophers throughout history. Aquinas, Leibniz, Descartes, and many others have argued for the existence of God on precisely these grounds. There must be a necessary being to explain the contingent universe. There must be an uncaused cause to terminate the chain of causation. There must be a ground of being to explain why there is anything at all. But this answer faces challenges. First, even if we grant that there must be a necessary being, why should it be God in any traditional religious sense? Why should it be personal, conscious, benevolent, interested in human affairs? The philosophical arguments point towards some kind of metaphysical foundation, but they don't tell us much about its nature. It could be an impersonal principle, a mathematical structure, a quantum field, something completely unlike anything we can conceive. Calling it God and attributing to it the properties described in religious texts seems like a leap that goes beyond what the arguments establish. Second, there's the question we've already raised. Even if God is a necessary being, why is there a necessary being? Why is there something whose nature includes existence? This doesn't feel like a satisfying stopping point. It feels like we've just labeled the mystery rather than solved it. We've said there's something called a necessary being, and that's why there's something rather than nothing. But we haven't really explained why there's a necessary being. We've just asserted that there is one, and the assertion feels arbitrary. Why this particular necessary being with these particular attributes? Why necessary existence as a property at all? The questions keep recurring, no matter how we try to answer them. Some theologians respond by saying that God's existence is self-explanatory in a way that nothing else could be. God is being itself, pure actuality, the ground and source of all existence. Asking why God exists is like asking why existence exists, which is nonsensical. God just is, and everything else derives from God. This is the approach of classical theism, particularly in the Thomistic tradition. God is not a being among beings, not an entity within reality, but being itself, the foundation that makes all other things possible. In this view, the question of why there is something rather than nothing is answered by pointing to the nature of God as necessary being, as the self-subsistent ground that cannot not be. But even this sophisticated theological answer might not satisfy everyone. It's still positing something, calling it God, and claiming it's self-explanatory. But why should we accept that anything is self-explanatory? Why can't we keep asking why? What makes God immune to the question that we apply to everything else? Maybe the truth is that explanation has to stop somewhere, and different worldviews choose different stopping points. For theists, it stops at God. For naturalists, it might stop at the laws of physics, or the quantum vacuum, or the multiverse. For nihilists, it might stop at brute fact, the acknowledgement that some things have no explanation. But wherever it stops, there's a sense in which the ultimate question remains unanswered. We've just chosen a place to stop asking. We've decided that this is fundamental, this doesn't need further explanation, this is where the chain of whys terminates. And maybe that's all we can ever do. Maybe there's no final answer that fully satisfies our desire for explanation, no ultimate reason that explains itself without remainder. Maybe existence is just the great given, the inexplicable foundation upon which all our explanations rest. Not because we failed to find the right explanation, but because explanation itself has limits, and we've reached the limit. Let's consider some of the more exotic ideas that have been proposed. One fascinating suggestion comes from physicist John Wheeler, who coined the phrase "it from bit." Wheeler proposed that information might be more fundamental than matter or energy. The physical universe, all the particles and forces and fields, might emerge from pure information, from bits of data, from the answers to yes or no questions. In this view, reality is fundamentally computational or informational, and what we call physical existence is a kind of running program, a processing of information according to certain rules. This connects to ideas in modern physics about the holographic principle, which suggests that all the information in a volume of space can be encoded on the boundary of that space, like a hologram. Perhaps the three-dimensional universe we experience is actually a projection of information encoded on a two-dimensional surface. Perhaps physics is really about information processing, and matter and energy are just the way information manifests. If information is fundamental, then maybe the question of why there is something rather than nothing becomes a question about why there is information rather than no information. But what would it mean for there to be no information? Information is about distinctions, differences, the fact that this is not that one thing can be true while another is false. Could there be a state with no distinctions at all? That would be complete uniformity, complete sameness, no structure, no pattern, no differentiation. And maybe that's what we mean by nothingness, not the absence of stuff, but the absence of any distinctions or information. But if the slightest distinction arises, if there's any information at all, then there's structure, and from structure, complexity can emerge, and eventually you get a whole universe. So maybe the transition from nothing to something is really the transition from zero information to some information, and that transition might be inevitable, because zero information is unstable or meaningless or impossible. This is highly speculative, of course. We're well beyond established science here, and into the realm of theoretical speculation and philosophical imagination. But that's where we have to go when we ask the ultimate questions. The answers, if there are any, aren't going to come from conventional methods. They require creative thinking, unusual perspectives, willingness to question our basic assumptions about reality. Another speculative idea comes from cosmologist Lee Smolin, who has proposed a kind of cosmological natural selection. Smolin suggests that new universes are born from black holes, and each new universe has slightly different laws of physics from its parent universe. Universes that produce lots of black holes have lots of offspring universes. Over time, this leads to a kind of evolution of universes, with the laws of physics being selected for based on how many black holes they produce. Our universe has the laws it has because these laws are good at producing black holes, which means they're descended from a long line of universes that were also good at producing black holes. This is a creative attempt to explain why the laws of physics are what they are without invoking fine-tuning or a multiverse or a designer. The laws evolve through a process analogous to natural selection. But it still doesn't answer the ultimate question. Where did the first universe come from? Why is there a process that produces universes from black holes? Why are there any laws at all, even if they evolve over time? Smolin's idea is fascinating, and it might explain some features of our universe, but like all scientific theories, it operates within a framework of assumptions and doesn't explain the framework itself. We're still left wondering why there's this framework rather than no framework, this process rather than no process, these evolving laws rather than no laws at all. Here's a thought that might help reframe the question. Maybe we're asking the wrong thing when we ask why there is something rather than nothing. Maybe the real question is, why does anything persist? Why doesn't everything just constantly pop into and out of existence randomly? Why is there continuity, stability, order? Because in principle, you might imagine a reality that's utterly chaotic, where particles blink in and out of existence with no pattern, where the laws of physics change from moment to moment, where there's no coherent structure at all. That would still be something rather than nothing, but it would be very different from our universe. Our universe has remarkable stability. The laws of physics are the same everywhere and at all times as far as we can tell. The constants of nature don't fluctuate. Particles maintain their identity over time. There's structure and order and predictability. So maybe the mystery isn't why there's something, but why there's ordered something. Why there's a cosmos rather than chaos. Why there's a universe that hangs together and makes sense. And maybe that's actually a more tractable question, because we can start to imagine answers. Maybe order is more stable than chaos. Maybe once any structure emerges, it tends to persist and reinforce itself, while chaos is fleeting and unstable. Maybe the laws of physics themselves are an attractor, a stable configuration that reality naturally settles into. This doesn't explain why there's reality at all, but it might explain why reality has the character it does. It shifts the question from existence to order, from being to structure. And structure might be easier to explain than being. Structure is about relationships, patterns, mathematical properties. And mathematics, as we've discussed, might be necessarily true, existing in some sense, even if there were no physical universe. So maybe what physics describes is the necessarily structure that any reality would have to exhibit in order to be coherent and stable. And that structure is what we experience as the physical universe with its laws and regularities. This brings us to the concept of symmetry and symmetry breaking, which is fundamental in modern physics. The universe seems to have started in a very symmetric state, and as it evolved, symmetries broke, leading to the diversity and complexity we see today. In the earliest moments after the Big Bang, the four fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, were unified into a single force. As the universe cooled, this symmetry broke. First gravity separated out, then the strong force, then electromagnetism and the weak force split apart. Each symmetry breaking created new possibilities, new kinds of particles, new structures. The universe differentiated itself from an initial state of maximum symmetry to our current state of broken symmetries and complex structure. This is a bit like water freezing into ice. Liquid water is very symmetric, the molecules can move in any direction. But when water freezes, It forms crystals with a specific structure, a specific pattern. The symmetry is broken. The ice has chosen a particular configuration out of all the possible configurations it could have taken. In the universe, symmetry breaking gave rise to particles with mass. In the very early universe, all particles were massless, zipping around at the speed of light. But as the Higgs field permeated space and the universe cooled, particles began interacting with the Higgs field, and this interaction gave them mass. The Higgs mechanism is a form of symmetry breaking. It's why electrons have mass, why quarks have mass, why most of the particles we're made of have the properties they do. Without this symmetry breaking, there would be no atoms, no chemistry, no complex structures, no life. So in some sense, the richness and complexity of the universe comes from broken symmetries, from the fact that the initial perfect symmetry of the early universe was unstable and collapsed into a less symmetric but more interesting configuration. This might be a clue to why there's something rather than nothing. Maybe perfect nothingness is like perfect symmetry, and it's unstable. Maybe the slightest perturbation, the tiniest fluctuation, breaks the symmetry of nothingness and gives rise to something. And once you have something, it can evolve and complexify and eventually produce galaxies and stars and planets and life and consciousness. But what could cause that initial fluctuation? What could disturb the perfect symmetry of absolute nothingness? This is where quantum mechanics becomes important again. In quantum mechanics, there's an uncertainty principle that says you can't have perfect stillness, perfect quietness, perfect emptiness. Even in a vacuum, even in the absence of particles, there are quantum fluctuations. The energy of empty space fluctuates slightly, and these fluctuations can create virtual particles that briefly pop into existence and then annihilate. The quantum vacuum is never truly empty. It seethes with activity. So if we think of nothingness as a quantum vacuum, then it's not stable. It naturally produces fluctuations, and those fluctuations could, under the right circumstances, balloon into entire universes. This is the idea behind quantum cosmology, the notion that the universe began as a quantum fluctuation in a pre-existing vacuum. But then we're back to asking where the vacuum came from, why there are quantum fields, why there's an uncertainty principle. The quantum explanation pushes the mystery back but doesn't eliminate it. Some physicists have tried to go even deeper. They've asked whether the laws of quantum mechanics themselves might emerge from something more fundamental. Maybe there's a pre-quantum reality, a deeper layer that doesn't yet have the structure of quantum mechanics, and somehow quantum behavior emerges from this substrate. But what could be more fundamental than quantum mechanics? What could underlie the uncertainty principle and wave functions and superposition? No one really knows. There are speculative ideas, theories of quantum gravity that try to merge quantum mechanics with general relativity, string theory and loop quantum gravity, and causal set theory and others. But these are all highly mathematical, highly abstract, and none of them are confirmed by experiment. We're at the frontier of human knowledge here, the edge of what our theories can describe. Beyond this edge is terra incognita, unknown territory that we can only speculate about. Let's shift our perspective and think about this question from the standpoint of consciousness and subjective experience. We've been talking mostly about the physical universe, about matter and energy and space and time. But there's another aspect of existence that's equally puzzling and equally fundamental: the fact of consciousness, the fact of inner experience, the fact that there's something it's like to be you. You are not just a collection of atoms arranged in a particular pattern. You are a perspective, a subject, a locus of awareness. You experience colors and sounds and sensations. You have thoughts and feelings and desires. There's an inner life, a subjective dimension to your existence. And this is just as mysterious as the existence of the physical universe, maybe more so. Why should matter give rise to consciousness? Why should certain configurations of atoms have inner experiences? Why should there be anything it's like to be anything? Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness. We can imagine explaining how the brain processes information, how neurons fire and create patterns of activity, how these patterns correlate with behavior and reports of experience. That's the easy problem, or at least the easier problem. But explaining why these physical processes are accompanied by subjective experience, why there's something it feels like from the inside, that's the hard problem. And no one has a convincing solution. We don't know why consciousness exists. We don't know how physical processes create or give rise to or are identical with subjective experiences. It's a deep mystery, arguably as deep as the mystery of why there's a physical universe at all. And some philosophers think these two mysteries might be connected. Maybe consciousness isn't something that emerges from unconscious matter. Maybe it's fundamental, woven into the fabric of reality from the start. Maybe the universe is, at its deepest level, experiential rather than material. Maybe what we call matter is actually just the external appearance of what is intrinsically consciousness or experience or something mental. This is the view called idealism, the idea that mind or consciousness is more fundamental than matter. Idealism has a long history in philosophy, going back to Berkeley and Kant and Hegel and others. In modern times, it's been revived in various forms. Some quantum physicists have suggested that consciousness plays a fundamental role in quantum mechanics, that the act of observation collapses the wave function and brings definite reality into being. Others have proposed panpsychism, the view that all matter has some degree of consciousness or proto-consciousness, and what we experience as human consciousness is just a very complex and integrated form of something that exists in some rudimentary way even in elementary particles. These ideas are controversial and not widely accepted in mainstream science, but they point to the deep difficulty of explaining consciousness in purely physical terms. If consciousness can't be reduced to physics, if it's something extra, something additional, then we need to expand our ontology, our catalogue of what exists. We need to include both matter and mind as fundamental features of reality. And if consciousness is fundamental, then maybe it's part of the answer to why there is something rather than nothing. Maybe the universe exists because it's experienced. Maybe existence is intrinsically tied to awareness. This is reminiscent of the participatory anthropic principle we discussed earlier, the idea that observers are not just passive witnesses, but active participants in creating reality. The physicist John Wheeler proposed a participatory universe, where the act of observation brings the universe into being retroactively. The early universe existed in a superposition of all possible states until conscious observers evolved, and then their observations collapsed the wave function backward through time, making the universe definite and real. This is a wild idea, and most physicists don't take it literally, but it captures something interesting. It suggests that existence and awareness might be two sides of the same coin, that you can't have being without knowing, that reality is fundamentally relational, a web of interactions and observations rather than a collection of independent objects. In some mystical and spiritual traditions, this idea is taken very seriously. Advaita Vedanta, a school of Hindu philosophy, teaches that ultimate reality is pure consciousness, called Brahman. Everything that exists is a manifestation of Brahman. The physical universe, with all its multiplicity and diversity, is Maya, an illusion or a play of consciousness. The true nature of reality is non-dual. There's no fundamental distinction between subject and object, observer and observed, self and world. All is one. Itaon is consciousness. When you realize this, when you see through the illusion de separación, you recognize your deepest nature as identical with ultimate realita. You are not a separate self in a world of objects. You are the infinite consciousness dreaming the dream of the universe. This is a beautiful and profound vision, and it offers a radically different answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. There is something because consciousness is the nature of reality, and consciousness cannot not be. Awareness is self-evident, self-luminous, necessarily existing. Nothingness, in the sense of no awareness whatsoever, is not a real possibility. It's a conceptual abstraction that doesn't correspond to anything real. But we can ask the same question we've been asking of other answers. Why is there consciousness? Why is Brahman? Why is there this infinite awareness rather than no awareness at all? The Vedantic answer might be that this question arises from the mistaken assumption that consciousness is a thing that could exist or not exist. But consciousness is not a thing. It's the background, the space, the light in which all things appear. It's the ground of being, and you can't ask for a ground of the ground. You can't stand outside of consciousness and ask why consciousness exists, because the asking itself is happening within consciousness. There's no perspective from which to view consciousness externally, because all perspectives are within consciousness. So the question collapses into incoherence. It's like asking, why is there seeing, when the very asking requires seeing? You can't escape consciousness to examine it from outside. You can only examine things within consciousness. Consciousness is the ultimate given, the inescapable context of all experience and all knowledge. And if that's true, then perhaps asking why consciousness exists is indeed meaningless. Consciousness just is. It's the foundation that can't be further explained because all explanations happen within it. This is similar to Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Descartes realized that he could doubt everything, the existence of the external world, the existence of his body, the truth of mathematics, everything except the fact that he was doubting. The very act of doubting proved that there was a doubter, a thinking thing, a consciousness. So consciousness, the fact of subjective awareness, is the one thing that cannot be doubted. It's the bedrock of certainty. And maybe it's also the bedrock of existence. Maybe the one thing we can be absolutely sure exists is consciousness. And everything else, matter, energy, space, time, is less certain, more inferential, potentially reducible to patterns of consciousness or experience. This turns the usual materialist picture upside down. Usually we think matter is solid and real, and consciousness is something fragile and dependent that emerges from matter. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe consciousness is rock-solid real, immediately evident, undeniable, and matter is a construct, a pattern of experiences, a way of organizing sensations. This doesn't mean the physical world is an illusion in the sense that it's not real. It just means that its reality is grounded in consciousness, not the other way around. These are deep and difficult ideas, and they take us far from everyday common sense. But that's appropriate because the question we're asking, why is there something rather than nothing, is not an everyday question. It's the ultimate question, the question that challenges everything we take for granted. And answering it might require us to revise our most basic assumptions about what is real, what is fundamental, what is the nature of existence itself. Let's consider another angle, the perspective of time and eternity. We've been assuming that existence happens in time, that things come into being and pass away, that the universe has a history. But what if this is a limited view? What if time itself is not fundamental? Einstein's theory of relativity already suggests that time is not absolute. Different observers moving at different speeds experience time differently. Time is relative to the observer, not a fixed background. And in general relativity, space and time are woven together into a four-dimensional space-time. The universe is not a three-dimensional space that changes over time. It's a four-dimensional block where past, present, and future all exist equally. This is called the block universe view. In this view, time doesn't flow. All moments of time are equally real, spread out in the four-dimensional space-time like frames in a film. Our experience of time flowing, of the present moment moving forward, is an illusion, or at least a feature of our consciousness, not a feature of reality itself. If the block universe view is correct, then the question of why there is something rather than nothing takes on a different character. It's not asking why the universe came into existence at a particular moment, because there is no coming into existence. The entire four-dimensional space-time just is. It exists timelessly, as a whole, with all moments of time equally real. The Big Bang is not an event that happened in the past. It's one end of the space-time, the temporal boundary, but it's not a moment when something started. It's just the edge of the block. And asking what came before the Big Bang is like asking what's before the beginning of a book. The book starts where it starts. There's nothing before page 1, because before is a temporal concept that only applies within the book, within the story, within time. Similarly, before is a temporal concept that only applies within space-time, not to space-time as a whole. So the question might not be why did the universe begin, but why is there this particular 4-dimensional space-time rather than no space-time at all? And that's a question about the existence of the whole structure, not about a temporal origin. Some physicists and philosophers have taken this even further. They've suggested that time is not even a fundamental feature of reality. Time might be emergent, something that appears at a macroscopic level but doesn't exist at the most fundamental level. This is an idea in some approaches to quantum gravity. At the Planck scale, the tiniest scale of space and time, the usual concepts of space and time might break down. Space-time might be discrete rather than continuous, or it might not exist at all, replaced by some more fundamental structure, a network of relationships or a quantum foam, or something we don't have words for yet. Time would then emerge from this deeper level in the same way that temperature emerges from the motion of molecules. Temperature is a macroscopic property that makes sense for large collections of particles, but doesn't make sense for individual particles. An individual molecule doesn't have a temperature. Similarly, time might be a macroscopic property that emerges from quantum interactions, but doesn't exist at the fundamental level. If time is emergent, then the question of why the universe began in time becomes easier to dissolve. There was no beginning in time because time itself is not fundamental. The deepest level of reality is timeless, and time emerges as a feature of our macroscopic experience. This connects to the idea of a timeless ground of being that we find in some religious and mystical traditions. God is often described as eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever through time, but in the sense of existing outside of time altogether. God is timeless, unchanging, fully present in an eternal now. From God's perspective, there is no past or future, only the fullness of being. Creation is not an event that happened at a particular moment. It's an eternal relationship, a timeless dependence of the universe on God. Similarly, in Buddhism, nirvana is described as the unconditioned, the timeless, the deathless. It's not a place or a time, but a state beyond time and becoming. The cycle of samsara, birth and death and rebirth, happens in time. But nirvana is the escape from that cycle into timelessness. These religious ideas might point to something philosophically significant. Maybe the deepest reality is indeed timeless, and time is a feature of the conditioned, changing, impermanent world. And if the deepest reality is timeless, then asking why it began or what caused it doesn't make sense. It doesn't begin. It doesn't have a cause. It simply is, eternally, outside the flow of time. But we can still ask why there is a timeless ground, rather than no ground at all. Why is there an eternal now rather than just nothing? The question persists even when we remove time from the picture. Maybe it persists because it's built into the structure of our thinking. We can't help but ask why. We're wired to seek explanations, to find causes, to understand reasons. Even when we know intellectually that a question might not make sense, we still feel the pull of the question. We still want an answer. This might be a feature of consciousness itself, the drive to understand, to explain, to find meaning and patterns. And maybe this drive is precisely why the question of existence is so haunting. It's the one question we can never fully answer, and yet we can never stop asking. It's the horizon that recedes as we approach, the mystery that deepens the more we explore it. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the universe should have at its heart an unanswerable question. Perhaps the fact that we can ask why there is something rather than nothing, and that we can recognize the question as profound and important even if we can't answer it. Perhaps that itself is part of what makes existence meaningful. Let's explore the concept of nothingness a bit more deeply, because we've been using the word without fully examining what it means. What would true nothingness be like? We've said it's not empty space, because space is something. It's not darkness, because darkness is the absence of light, which still presupposes space and time. True nothingness would have no space, no time, no properties, no potential, no laws, no structure. It would be the complete absence of everything. But can we even conceive of this? When you try to imagine nothingness, what do you picture? Most people picture a void, an emptiness, a blank expanse, but that's still something. That's still a container, a space waiting to be filled. True nothingness wouldn't be a container. It wouldn't be waiting. It wouldn't be anything. It would be nothing. And the moment you try to think about it, you've turned it into something, a concept, an object of thought. So maybe nothingness is literally inconceivable. Maybe our minds can't grasp it because minds are structures, and structures can't grasp the absence of all structure. We can talk about nothingness, but we can't really think it. We can only think about the concept of nothingness, which is itself something. This has led some philosophers to argue that nothingness is not a real possibility. It's a linguistic fiction, a grammatical placeholder, but not something that could actually be. Parmenides argued this in ancient Greece, and some modern philosophers have revived similar arguments. If you can't coherently conceive of nothingness, if it's not a real possibility even in principle, then asking why there's something rather than nothing is asking why reality is the way it has to be. And that question might answer itself. Reality is the way it has to be, because there's no alternative. Nothingness is not an alternative. It's not a possible state of affairs. Existence is necessary because non-existence is impossible. This is a strong claim, and not everyone accepts it, but it has a certain appeal. It dissolves the mystery by denying that there ever was a real alternative to existence. There has to be something, because nothingness is incoherent, impossible, not even wrong, but simply meaningless. On the other hand, some philosophers have argued that nothingness is not only possible, but in some sense actual. They point out that in quantum mechanics, particles can pop into existence from nothing and then annihilate back into nothing. The vacuum is a seething foam of virtual particles constantly being created and destroyed. So in some sense, nothingness is unstable, and something is always emerging from it. But as we've noted, this quantum nothing is not really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum, which has structure and laws and properties. It's something. True metaphysical nothingness would be more radical. It would be the absence even of quantum fields, even of the potential for particles to pop into existence. And that kind of nothingness might indeed be impossible, or it might be the default state from which any existence is a miraculous exception. We don't know. We're speculating at the limits of thought. Here's another perspective that might help. Maybe the question of why there is something rather than nothing is not a question about origins or causes, but a question about necessity and contingency. Some things are contingent, meaning they could have been otherwise. You could have had cereal for breakfast instead of toast. That's contingent. Other things are necessary, meaning they couldn't have been otherwise. The angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees necessarily in Euclidean geometry. That couldn't be different. Now, is the existence of the universe contingent or necessary? Is it something that could have been otherwise, or is it something that had to be? If it's contingent, then we can ask why this contingent fact obtains rather than some other possibility. And the answer might involve pointing to a cause or a reason or a choice. But if it's necessary, then asking why it exists is like asking why 2 + 2 = 4. Exists because it has to. Its non-existence is not a real possibility. So which is it? Is existence contingent or necessary? Most people's intuition is that existence is contingent. It seems like we can easily imagine that nothing had ever existed. There's no logical contradiction in that supposition. So existence seems contingent, but maybe our intuitions are misleading us. Maybe when we think we're imagining nothingness, We're actually just imagining a very sparse something, or we're imagining ourselves not existing within a world that still exists. True nothingness, the absence of everything, including possibilities and laws and logical space, might not be imaginable and might not be possible. If it's not possible, then existence is necessary. And if existence is necessary, then the question of why there is something rather than nothing is answered. There's something because there has to be. Nothingness is impossible. Existence is the only option. This might seem like a cheat, like we're just declaring the problem solved by fiat. But it might be true. It might be that the universe, or reality, or being, is a necessary feature of, well, of what? Of logical space? Of the structure of possibility itself? Of the nature of being? It's hard to say because we've reached the limit of our concepts. We're trying to talk about what grounds or explains existence, but any ground or explanation would itself be something, and we'd be back to asking why that exists. The circle closes, and we're left either with necessity or with brute fact, and maybe those are the same thing. Let's consider the role of logic in all of this. Logic seems to be something that exists necessarily, the law of non-contradiction, that something can't both be and not be in the same way at the same time, seems necessarily true. If I say the book is on the table and also not on the table in the same sense at the same moment, I've contradicted myself, and one of those statements must be false. This logical principle doesn't depend on the physical universe. It would be true even if there were no books, no tables, no physical objects at all. Logic seems to transcend the physical world. It's part of the structure of rational thought itself. So maybe logic exists necessarily, and maybe the physical universe is constrained by logic. Maybe only logically possible universes can exist, and our universe exists because it's logically possible. But this doesn't quite answer our question either, because we're still left wondering why there's a realm of logical possibility at all. Why are there logical laws? Why is there rationality? Why is there structure to thought and reality? Could there have been no logic, no rational structure, just complete incoherence? That seems impossible to imagine, and maybe it's impossible in fact. Maybe logic is the ultimate necessary truth, and everything else follows from it. Some philosophers have explored the idea that the universe might be the way it is for logical or mathematical reasons. Perhaps the laws of physics are not arbitrary but are the unique solution to some fundamental equation, or the only logically consistent way for a universe to exist. This is a beautiful idea because it would explain so much. It would explain why these laws, rather than others, they're the only ones that work. And it would ground physics in mathematics and logic, which seem to be necessarily true. But there are problems with this approach. First, as we've discussed, there seem to be many logically consistent ways for a universe to be. We can imagine different laws, different constants, different structures, and none of them seem to involve logical contradictions. So it's not obvious that our universe is the unique logical possibility. Second, even if it were, we'd still be left asking why logic constrains reality. Why should the universe obey logical laws? Why should what is logically possible also be physically actual? There seems to be a gap between logical possibility and physical existence, and bridging that gap is just as mysterious as the original question. Perhaps we need to think more carefully about what we mean by possible. When we say something is possible, we might mean it's logically possible, not contradictory, coherent in principle. Or we might mean it's physically possible, compatible with the laws of nature in our universe. Or we might mean it's metaphysically possible, genuinely an alternative way reality could have been. These are different kinds of possibility, and they don't all line up. Something might be logically possible, but physically impossible, like traveling faster than light. In our universe, the speed of light is an absolute limit. Nothing with mass can reach it, but there's no logical contradiction in the idea of faster than light travel. It's just not compatible with our physics. Similarly, something might be logically possible, but metaphysically impossible. It might be that there are constraints on reality deeper than logic, or that not all logical possibilities correspond to genuine metaphysical possibilities. Maybe only certain logically consistent structures can actually exist, and there's some principle that determines which ones. We don't know what that principle would be, but positing it might help narrow down the space of possibilities. The question of why there is something rather than nothing might be related to the question of why this something rather than some other something. These seem like distinct questions, but maybe they're connected. If we could explain why the universe has the specific features it has, why these laws, these constants, this history, maybe that explanation would also shed light on why there's a universe at all, or maybe not. Maybe the question of why this particular universe is entirely separate from the question of why any universe at all. It's possible to imagine answering one question without answering the other. We might find a theory of everything that explains all the features of our universe, but still leaves us wondering why that theory is instantiated, why there's something for the theory to describe. Or we might find an answer to why there must be something rather than nothing, but still have no explanation for why that something has the particular character it does. These are frustrating possibilities, but they might be the truth. We might be stuck with partial explanations, fragments of understanding, without ever achieving the complete picture we crave. Let's think about the concept of creation for a moment. In many religious traditions, the answer to why there is something rather than nothing is that God created everything. God spoke the universe into being, or willed it into existence, or emanated it from divine essence. Creation is an act of power, of will, of love, of self-expression. God creates because it is God's nature to create, or because God desires to share being, or because creation glorifies God. These are theological answers, and they satisfy many people. They provide a narrative, a story about how something came from nothing through the agency of a supreme being. But they also raise philosophical questions. If God created the universe, did God create it in time or outside of time? If in time, then there was a moment before creation when there was God but no universe. What was God doing then? Was God alone, contemplating creation, preparing to act? And what triggered the moment of creation? Why then rather than earlier or later? These questions troubled St. Augustine, who proposed that God created time along with the universe, so there was no before. Time itself is part of creation. God exists in eternity, outside of time, and from that eternal perspective, creation is not an event but a timeless act. This is philosophically sophisticated, but it's also hard to grasp. What does it mean for God to act timelessly? Action seems to imply sequence, a before and after, a state prior to the act, and a state after it. But if God's creative act is timeless, there's no before or after. There's just the eternal relationship between God and the created universe. The universe depends on God for its existence at every moment, not because God caused it at a particular time in the past, but because God sustains it in being timelessly. This shifts the question from why did God create to why does God create, or simply, why is there creation? And the traditional answer is that creation manifests God's goodness, God's glory, God's love. God creates out of abundance, not out of need. God doesn't need the universe, but God freely chooses to bring it into being as an expression of divine nature. This is a beautiful theological vision, and for many people, it resolves the mystery. But for others, it just relocates the mystery. Why is there a God with this nature? Why is there a being who creates? Why is divine goodness expressed through creation rather than remaining purely self-contained? Some theologians have responded by saying these questions misconstrue the nature of God. God is not a being among beings, not an entity we can ask why questions about in the same way we ask about contingent things. God is being itself, the ground of all existence, the source from which everything flows. Asking why God exists is like asking why existence exists, which is either a nonsense question or a question that answers itself. Existence exists because that's what existence is. Being is. This is close to the answer we considered earlier, that existence is a brute fact, the stopping point of explanation. But by framing it in theological terms, by calling this brute fact God, we give it personality, consciousness, will. We make it something we can relate to, pray to, worship. This might be a deep truth about reality, that the ground of being is not an impersonal principle but a personal God. Or it might be a projection, a human need to personalize the ultimate mystery, to turn the abstract into something concrete and relatable. We can't settle this question here, but it's worth noting that the religious answer and the philosophical answer might converge at this point. Both might be pointing toward the same mystery, just using different language and concepts. Now let's think about the role of chance and randomness. Could the universe exist by pure chance, with no reason, no cause, no explanation? Some people find this idea appealing. It avoids the infinite regress of causes and the problem of a first cause. It says that existence is just a random fact, a cosmic accident, something that happened for no reason at all. Things don't always need reasons. Sometimes things just happen. Radioactive decay is random. A particular atom decays at a particular moment, and there's no cause for why it decayed at that moment rather than some other moment. It's genuinely random, as far as we can tell. Quantum mechanics is full of randomness like this, so maybe the universe itself is a random event. It just popped into existence uncaused, for no reason, and here we are. This is philosophically unsatisfying to many people, because it feels like giving up on explanation. If we allow that the biggest fact of all, the existence of everything, has no explanation, then what's to stop us from saying nothing has an explanation? Why not just accept brute randomness everywhere and abandon the search for understanding? But maybe that's too quick. Maybe there's a difference between randomness within a framework and randomness of the framework itself. Quantum mechanics gives us randomness in the behavior of particles, but it does so within a very precise mathematical framework. The randomness is constrained by probabilities, by the Schrödinger equation, by the structure of quantum theory. It's lawful randomness, if that makes sense. The individual events are unpredictable, but the statistical patterns are highly regular and predictable. So quantum randomness is not chaos. It's structured unpredictability. Could the existence of the universe be like that? Could it be a random event within some larger structure of possibilities? If so, then we're back to asking about that larger structure. Why is there a framework of possibilities within which random events occur? Why are there probabilities and laws governing randomness? The randomness explanation might work at one level, but it pushes the question to a deeper level. There's also the question of whether pure randomness with no structure at all, would even be coherent. If there were no laws, no patterns, no regularities, just complete chaos, could that count as a universe? Could it count as something existing? Existence seems to require some kind of identity, some structure that makes a thing what it is. A completely random, structureless, chaotic flux doesn't seem to be a thing at all. It's more like the absence of things, the absence of order, which is close to nothingness. So maybe pure randomness and nothingness are closer than we think. Maybe the transition from nothing to something requires some structure, some order, some lawfulness. And once you have that, you have something rather than nothing, and you also have something rather than pure chaos. The universe might occupy a middle ground between absolute nothingness and absolute chaos, a region where there's enough structure to create stable patterns, and enough randomness to create novelty and complexity. And maybe that middle ground is the only region where existence is possible, where something can be without being either nothing or pure chaos. Let's return to the idea of necessity one more time, because it's central to many answers to our question. The claim that something exists necessarily means that it exists in all possible worlds, that its non-existence is not a genuine possibility. But what determines what's possible? What makes a possible world possible? One answer is that logic determines possibility. A possible world is a logically consistent way things could be. Anything that doesn't involve a contradiction is possible. But this seems too permissive. It would make all sorts of bizarre, unphysical things possible. Unicorns are logically possible. They don't involve any contradiction. But they don't exist in our world. So logical possibility is not the same as real possibility. There must be some further constraint. Some philosophers have suggested that the actual world, our world, is the measure of real possibility. Something is possible if it's compatible with the actual laws of nature and the actual history of the universe. But this seems too restrictive. It would make it impossible for the laws of nature to have been different, which seems wrong. We can coherently imagine a universe with different laws. So real possibility is somewhere between logical possibility and actual fact. Metaphysical possibility is often invoked as the middle ground. Something is metaphysically possible if it's genuinely a way reality could have been, not just logically coherent, but also metaphysically coherent, compatible with the deep structure of reality. But what is that deep structure? How do we know what's metaphysically possible versus just logically possible? These are difficult questions, and philosophers disagree sharply about them. Some think metaphysical possibility is just logical possibility. Others think it's much more constrained. And if we don't have a clear grasp of what's possible, then claims about necessity become unclear too. To say that something exists necessarily is to say it exists in all possible worlds. But if we don't know which worlds are possible, we don't know what necessity amounts to. This is a frustrating situation. We're trying to use the concept of necessity to explain why there's something rather than nothing, but the concept itself is murky and disputed. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe at this fundamental level, our concepts start to break down, and we're left grasping at intuitions and half-formed ideas rather than clear, precise definitions. Here's a thought experiment that might help clarify things. Imagine that you could step outside of reality, if such a thing made sense, and survey all the possible ways things could be. You see an infinite array of possible universes, each one a different configuration, a different set of laws, a different history. Some have life, some don't. Some are chaotic, some are orderly, some are vast, some are tiny. They're all spread out before you, all equally possible. Now the question is, which of these possible universes are actual? Which ones really exist? One answer is that only one is actual, our universe, the one we happen to inhabit. All the others are merely possible abstract structures that could have been but aren't. Another answer is that all of them are actual, that every possible universe exists in some sense. This is modal realism, the view defended by philosopher David Lewis. According to modal realism, when we talk about possible worlds, we're not talking about abstract entities or fictions. We're talking about real, concrete universes just as real as ours, existing in parallel, causally isolated from each other. We can't visit them or observe them, but they're there, making all possibilities actual. Modal realism is a radical view, and most philosophers reject it as extravagant. It multiplies entities beyond a necessity. Why should we believe in all these unobservable universes just to make sense of modal language, of talk about what's possible and necessary? But Lewis argued that modal realism actually simplifies our ontology in some ways. It takes modal talk at face value. When we say unicorns are possible, we mean there's a possible world where unicorns exist, and according to Lewis, that means there's a real world, somewhere out there in the vast multiverse where unicorns actually exist. This feels absurd, but it has a certain logical elegance. And if modal realism is true, then the question of why there is something rather than nothing has a clear answer. There's something because everything exists. All possible universes are actual. Existence is maximal. There's no selector choosing which possibilities to actualize, because they're all actualized. Nothingness would be the absence of all possible worlds, but since all possible worlds exist by definition, nothingness is impossible. This is a form of the necessity answer. Existence is necessary because all possibilities are actual, and nothingness is not a possibility. But even modal realism doesn't fully resolve the mystery, because we can still ask why there's this modal space, this array of possible worlds, rather than no modal space at all? Why is there possibility? Why is there a structure of logical space that contains all these different configurations? Lewis would probably say that's just a brute fact, the ultimate given that can't be explained further. And maybe he's right. Maybe at some point, explanation runs out, and we're left with brute facts, with things that simply are without further reason. The question is whether we're comfortable stopping there, accepting that the ultimate structure of reality is just given, or whether we want to keep pushing, keep asking why, even when we suspect there might be no answer. Different temperaments will respond differently. Some people are content to rest in mystery, to accept that not everything can be explained. Others feel compelled to keep questioning, to push against the boundaries of understanding, even if they never reach a final answer. Let's think about beauty and order for a moment, because there's something aesthetically striking about the universe. It's not just that it exists, it's that it's beautiful, ordered, elegant. The laws of physics are mathematically simple, expressible in compact equations. The structure of space-time, the behavior of quantum fields, the dynamics of galaxies and stars. All of this follows patterns that we can describe and understand. There's a harmony to it, a coherence. Einstein famously said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Why should the universe be understandable to us? Why should our mathematics, developed by human minds for human purposes, turn out to describe the deep structure of reality? This is sometimes called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Mathematics is unreasonably good at describing the physical world. Equations we develop for abstract, theoretical reasons turn out to predict real phenomena with astonishing accuracy. Why? One answer is that the universe is fundamentally mathematical, that reality is made of math, and our mathematical discoveries are discoveries about the structure of reality itself. This brings us back to the mathematical universe hypothesis we discussed earlier. If the universe is a mathematical structure, then of course mathematics describes it. Math is not a tool we use to approximate reality. Math is reality. But there's still something puzzling about the particular mathematics that describes our universe. Why these equations rather than others? Why this particular mathematical structure rather than some other structure? There are infinitely many possible mathematical structures. Some are simple, some are complex. Some are beautiful, some are ugly. Some support complexity in life, most don't. Our universe seems to be described by relatively simple, elegant mathematics. And that mathematics happens to allow for the emergence of complexity, chemistry, biology, consciousness. Is this a coincidence? Is it selection bias, the anthropic principle at work? Or is there something deeper going on? Some physicists have suggested that simplicity might be a fundamental principle. Maybe the universe is described by the simplest possible mathematics, the minimal structure that can exist. This would explain the elegance of the laws. They're as simple as they can be while still being sufficient to support a universe. But what determines simplicity? Why should the universe prefer simple laws to complex ones? And is simplicity even a well-defined concept? What seems simple to us might not be objectively simple. Simplicity might be in the eye of the beholder, dependent on our cognitive structures and aesthetic preferences. Still, there's something compelling about the idea that the universe is the way it is, because that's the simplest or most elegant or most beautiful way it could be. This is reminiscent of Leibniz's idea that this is the best of all possible worlds, that God created the universe with the optimal balance of variety and order, of simplicity and richness. Voltaire mocked this idea in Candide, pointing out all the suffering and evil in the world. But Leibniz wasn't claiming that this world has the most pleasure and the least pain. He was claiming that it has the best balance of metaphysical features, the most being with the most order, the richest structure with the simplest laws. From that perspective, a universe with life and consciousness and complexity, even if it includes suffering, might be better than a universe that's perfectly harmonious but sterile and simple. This is a value judgment, and it's hard to assess. But it points to the idea that aesthetic or axiological principles, principles of value and beauty, might play a role in why the universe is the way it is. Maybe existence is not just a brute fact or a random accident or a logical necessity. Maybe it's an expression of value, of goodness, of beauty. Maybe the universe exists because existence is good, and goodness tends to actualize itself. This is a deeply Platonic idea. Plato thought that the forms, the perfect, eternal, unchanging templates of things, were ordered in a hierarchy with the form of the good at the top. The good radiates being, drawing things into existence by its perfection and attractiveness. Things exist to the extent that they participate in the good, that they embody value and order and beauty. The physical world is an imperfect reflection of the perfect forms, but it exists because it's drawn into being by the pull of the good. This is a beautiful vision, and it offers a teleological answer to our question. The universe exists for a purpose, for the sake of the good, to manifest value and beauty and order. But it faces the same problem as other answers. Why is there a form of the good? Why is there a hierarchy of value? Why is there this Platonic realm rather than nothing? We're back to the same question, just framed in terms of value rather than being or cause or necessity. Perhaps we need to consider the possibility that the question itself is based on a false assumption. When we ask why there is something rather than nothing, we're assuming that these are two distinct alternatives, two different possible states of affairs. But what if something and nothing aren't really opposites? What if they're more like two different perspectives on the same reality? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest something like this. The quantum vacuum, as we've discussed, is not empty. It's full of virtual particles, quantum fluctuations, fields that permeate all of space. But these quantum fields are in their ground state, their lowest energy configuration. In one sense, the vacuum is full of potential, of structure, of activity. In another sense, it's empty of actual particles. It's both something and nothing, depending on how you look at it. Before a particle is observed or measured, it exists in superposition, in a state that's neither definitely here nor definitely there. It's smeared out, probabilistic, not quite fully real. Is that something or nothing? It's in between. It's potential being, hovering between actuality and non-existence. This in-between state might be fundamental to reality. Maybe the sharp distinction between being and non-being that we assume in our everyday thinking doesn't apply at the deepest level. Maybe reality is fundamentally probabilistic, fuzzy, intermediate between the extremes of absolute being and absolute nothingness. This would make the question of why there's something rather than nothing less sharp, less clear-cut. It wouldn't be a choice between two distinct alternatives, but more like a spectrum, with pure being at one end and pure nothingness at the other, and reality existing somewhere in the middle, partaking of both. This is strange to think about, but quantum mechanics forces us to think in strange ways. It challenges our classical intuitions about what it means for something to exist. And if our intuitions about existence are flawed, then our question about why there is existence might be flawed too. We might be asking the wrong question, using concepts that don't apply cleanly to the fundamental nature of reality. Let's explore another perspective from Eastern philosophy. In Taoism, there's a concept called Wu, which is often translated as nothingness or non-being, and Yu, which is being or existence. But Wu is not simple absence. It's more like the generative void, the pregnant emptiness from which all things emerge. The Tao Te Ching says that being and non-being produce each other, that they're complementary rather than contradictory. From the Tao, from the ultimate source, both being and non-being flow. And the Tao itself is beyond being and non-being, beyond all distinctions and categories. It's the nameless, formless origin that can't be captured in concepts or language. When Taoists speak of returning to the Tao, they're speaking of going beyond the world of things and distinctions, beyond the realm where being and non-being make sense, to a more fundamental level that transcends these categories. In this view, asking why there is something rather than nothing might be like asking why there are waves rather than no waves. The question assumes waves and ocean are separate, But waves are just the ocean in motion. Being and non-being are just the Tao in different modes. They're not alternatives, but complementary aspects of the same reality. This non-dualistic thinking is common in Eastern philosophy and quite different from the Western philosophical tradition, which tends to think in terms of clear either-or categories. Western philosophy asks whether things exist or don't exist, whether statements are true or false, whether causes are present or absent. But Eastern philosophy often embraces paradox, contradiction, the coincidence of opposites, both and rather than either or. The universe is both something and nothing, both eternal and temporal, both one and many. These aren't contradictions to be resolved, but mysteries to be contemplated, truths that transcend logic. This doesn't mean abandoning rationality or accepting nonsense. It means recognizing that ultimate reality might not fit neatly into our conceptual boxes, that the deepest truths might require a different mode of thinking than the analytical, categorizing mode we usually employ. And if that's right, then our question about existence might not have a rational answer in the usual sense. It might require a shift in consciousness, a different way of seeing, an intuitive grasp rather than a logical deduction. Zen Buddhism takes this even further. Zen koans are paradoxical questions or statements designed to short-circuit rational thinking and provoke insight. One famous koan asks, "What is your original face before you were born?" Another asks, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" These aren't riddles with clever answers. They're meant to push the mind beyond conceptual thinking into direct experience, direct seeing. And our question, why is there something rather than nothing, might function as a kind of koan. It's a question that the rational mind can't answer, and struggling with it might eventually lead to a breakthrough, a shift in perspective where the question dissolves not because we've found an answer, but because we've seen through the assumptions that made the question seem meaningful in the first place. We realize that being and non-being are concepts we impose on reality, not features of reality itself. Reality just is, prior to our conceptual divisions, and the question of why it is, rather than isn't, evaporates when we stop thinking in those terms. But does this approach really resolve the mystery, or does it just sidestep it? Is the dissolution of the question genuine insight, or is it a failure of nerve, a retreat from the hard work of rational explanation? Western philosophers would likely be skeptical. They'd say that yes, our concepts might be limited, but that doesn't mean we should abandon them. It means we should refine them, sharpen them, find better concepts. And the question of why there is something rather than nothing is a legitimate question deserving a serious answer. We shouldn't mystify it or dissolve it into paradox. We should tackle it head-on with the best tools of logic and reason we have. And maybe that's fair. Maybe both approaches have value. Maybe we need both the analytical, questioning approach of Western philosophy and the intuitive, contemplative approach of Eastern philosophy. Maybe the truth, if there is one, requires holding both perspectives simultaneously, thinking and not thinking, questioning and accepting, seeking answers and resting in mystery. Let's consider the role of emergence, because emergence might shed light on how something can come from nothing, or at least from something simpler. Emergence is the phenomenon where complex patterns and properties arise from simpler components, interacting according to simple rules. Water molecules are simple, but when billions of them interact, you get complex phenomena, like waves and currents and surface tension. Neurons are simple, firing or not firing based on chemical signals, but when billions of them connect and interact in a brain, you get consciousness, thought, emotion. The complex emerges from the simple. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. This is a common pattern in nature. Simple rules can generate extraordinary complexity. Conway's game of life, a mathematical game played on a grid, has only 4 simple rules about when cells turn on or off, but these rules can generate incredibly complex patterns, structures that move and replicate and interact in surprising ways. The complexity wasn't programmed in. It emerged from the simple rules. Could the universe be like this? Could existence itself be an emergent phenomenon, arising from something simpler that we might not even recognize as something? Maybe there's a pre-existing substrate, not nothing but not what we'd call a universe either, just some very simple structure or process, and from that substrate, through some kind of emergent process, the universe as we know it arises, with all its complexity and richness. The substrate might be quantum fields in a ground state, or it might be something more abstract, a mathematical structure, or a logical framework, or pure potentiality, and the emergence of the universe would be the actualization of that potential, the complexification of that simple structure, the manifestation of patterns latent in the substrate. This doesn't fully answer our question because we'd still need to explain the substrate, but it reframes the question. Instead of asking why there's a complex universe rather than nothing, we're asking why there's a simple substrate and how it gives rise to complexity. And that might be an easier question to answer, or at least a different question with different available responses. Emergence also relates to consciousness in interesting ways. If consciousness is an emergent property of complex information processing, then it's not something separate from the physical world, but something that arises within it under the right conditions. And if consciousness is emergent, then maybe existence itself is emergent in a similar way. Maybe there's no hard line between being and non-being, but rather a gradual emergence of existence from non-existence, or from something so simple and minimal that it barely counts as existence. Quantum fluctuations are like this. They're temporary, fleeting, barely there. But under the right circumstances, they can be amplified, stabilized, made permanent. A quantum fluctuation in the early universe could be stretched by cosmic inflation and eventually become a galaxy. The tiny, barely real becomes the large and concrete. The marginal existence becomes full existence. This suggests a picture where existence is not an all-or-nothing affair but comes in degrees. Things can be more or less real, more or less existent, and maybe at the very beginning or at the very foundation, there's something that's just barely existent, hovering on the edge of being, and from that minimal starting point, full existence emerges and complexifies and eventually produces the universe we observe. This relates to an idea in process philosophy, particularly the work of Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead proposed that reality is fundamentally about processes and events rather than static substances. Things don't just exist in a timeless way, they become. They're constantly coming into being, actualizing potentials, transitioning from what they were to what they're becoming. The universe is not a collection of things, but a web of processes, a creative advance into novelty. In this view, existence is not a state, but an activity, a happening, an ongoing event. Asking why there is something rather than nothing becomes asking why there is this creative process rather than no process. And Whitehead's answer involves something like a cosmic aim or drive toward novelty and complexity, a metaphysical principle that pushes reality toward richer and more complex forms of existence. This is close to the Platonic idea of the good drawing things into being, but Whitehead frames it in terms of process and creativity rather than static forms. Reality exists because existence is creative, productive, generative. Non-existence would be stagnation, the absence of creativity, and maybe stagnation is less natural, less stable, less fundamental than creativity and becoming. But again, we can ask why there's this creative process. Why is reality generative rather than static? Why is there a drive toward novelty? Whitehead would probably say, this is the nature of ultimate reality, that creativity is the fundamental metaphysical principle. But we're back to the same pattern. Every answer appeals to something fundamental, and we can always ask why that fundamental thing exists rather than not. Maybe this is unavoidable. Maybe every explanatory framework has to bottom out somewhere, has to posit something as fundamental and unexplained. The choice is what we take as fundamental. Do we take matter as fundamental, or mind, or God, or mathematical structure, or quantum fields, or creativity, or the Tao? Different worldviews make different choices, and maybe there's no way to adjudicate between them, no neutral standpoint from which to judge which fundamental principle is the right one. We're stuck within our perspectives, our frameworks, our conceptual schemes. We can't step outside all of them to see which one matches reality as it is in itself. This is the challenge of metaphysics. Metaphysics tries to describe the ultimate nature of reality, the most fundamental features of what exists. But we can only approach reality through our concepts, our language, our theories. We can't access reality directly, unmediated by thought and language. So, our metaphysical theories might tell us more about how we think than about how reality actually is. This doesn't mean metaphysics is useless or that all metaphysical views are equally good. Some theories are more coherent, more comprehensive, more explanatory than others. But it does mean we should be humble about our metaphysical claims, recognizing that we're always working within limitations, always seeing through a glass darkly. The ultimate nature of reality might be beyond our capacity to fully grasp, not because we're not smart enough, but because the tools we have, language and concepts and logic, are tools designed for navigating the everyday world, and they might not scale up to the ultimate questions about existence itself. It's like trying to measure the universe with a ruler. The ruler works fine for measuring tables and rooms and buildings, but it's inadequate for cosmic distances. We need different tools. And maybe for the ultimate question of why there is anything at all, we need tools we don't have or maybe can't have, as finite beings embedded in the reality we're trying to understand. Let's think about infinity for a moment, because infinity plays a strange role in these discussions. If the universe is infinite, spatially infinite, or temporally infinite, or infinite in the number of possible configurations, then in some sense it contains everything. Every possible arrangement of matter, every possible history, every possible world, all exist somewhere or somewhen in the infinite expanse. This is similar to the modal realism we discussed earlier, but grounded in physical infinity rather than metaphysical possibility. If the universe is infinite, and matter is distributed with some degree of randomness, then every possible configuration will occur somewhere, infinitely many times in fact. There will be infinite copies of you reading these words, infinite versions of Earth's history with slight variations, infinite galaxies and stars and planets. Infinity makes existence maximal. There's not just something, there's everything, infinitely repeated. This might seem like an answer to why there's something. There's something because there's everything. Existence is total, complete, holding nothing back. But we can still ask why there's an infinite universe rather than a finite one, or no universe at all. Infinity doesn't eliminate the question. It just makes existence bigger, more abundant. And infinity raises its own puzzles. Is infinity real, or just a mathematical abstraction? Can there actually be infinitely many things? Or is infinity just a useful fiction, a way of talking about very large numbers without specifying exactly how large? Some mathematicians and philosophers are finitists. They reject the reality of infinity, insisting that only finite quantities are real. Others are comfortable with actual infinity, infinite sets, infinite series, infinite quantities existing in reality. This is more than an abstract debate. It has implications for cosmology. If space is infinite, then our observable universe is just a tiny, finite patch within an infinite whole, and most of reality is forever beyond our reach, unobservable in principle. If time is infinite into the past, then the universe has always existed, and there's no beginning to explain. If time is infinite into the future, then the universe will never end, and all possible events will eventually occur. These are dizzying thoughts, and they push against our intuitions about existence. We're used to thinking about finite things, things with boundaries and limits. Infinity is alien to our everyday experience. We can calculate with it, manipulate it mathematically, but can we really understand it? Can we grasp what it would mean for something to be truly infinite? If we can't fully grasp infinity, then claims about the universe being infinite, or reality being infinite, might be beyond our cognitive reach. We might be making claims we can't fully understand or evaluate. And this brings us back to the limits of human understanding. We're finite beings. Our brains are finite, our lifespans are finite, our experiences are finite. We live in a small patch of space and time, and we try to understand the whole of reality from this limited vantage point. It's an audacious project, and in many ways a successful one. We've learned an enormous amount about the universe, from the smallest particles to the largest cosmic structures. But there might be limits to what we can know, not just practical limits based on technology or time, but in principle limits based on the nature of knowledge and understanding. Some truths might be too complex for our finite minds to grasp. Some questions might require an infinite intelligence to answer, and the question of why there is something rather than nothing might be one of those questions. It might be the ultimate limit question, the one that marks the boundary of what finite beings can understand. If that's true, then we should expect our attempts to answer the question to be partial, fragmentary, inconclusive. We should expect to feel unsatisfied, to sense that we're circling around the mystery without ever quite grasping it. And maybe that's exactly what we find. Every answer we've considered has something to recommend it, some insight to offer, but none of them feels complete. None of them fully resolves the mystery. The theological answer points to God but doesn't explain God. The scientific answer points to quantum fields or multiverses, but doesn't explain why there are quantum fields or multiverses. The philosophical answer points to necessary being or brute facts, but doesn't explain why there's necessity or why we should accept brute facts. The mystical answer dissolves the question, but might be evading it rather than answering it. We're left with fragments, pieces of a puzzle that we can't quite fit together into a complete picture. And maybe that's as good as it gets. Maybe the complete picture is beyond us, and we have to content ourselves with fragments, with partial understanding, with intimations of a truth that we can't fully articulate. But even fragments have value. Even partial understanding is worth pursuing. Because in grappling with this question, we learn about reality, about ourselves, about the nature of explanation and understanding. We clarify our concepts, we sharpen our reasoning, we explore the boundaries of knowledge. The journey matters even if we don't reach a final destination. The questioning matters even if we don't find a definitive answer. And there's something profound about being the kind of creature that can ask this question at all. Rocks don't wonder why they exist. Trees don't puzzle over the nature of being. But we do. We have the capacity for self-reflection, for stepping back from our immediate experience and asking deep questions about the nature of reality. This capacity is part of what makes us human, part of what gives our lives meaning and purpose. We're not just surviving and reproducing. We're trying to understand, to make sense of things, to find our place in the larger scheme of existence. And that's valuable in itself, regardless of whether we find the ultimate answers we seek. Perhaps the value is in the questioning itself, in the stance of wonder and curiosity that the question embodies. When we ask why there is something rather than nothing, we're expressing awe at the sheer fact of existence. We're recognizing that existence is not to be taken for granted, that it's strange and marvelous and mysterious. We're refusing to be complacent, refusing to accept reality as simply given without wondering about it. This sense of wonder is what drives philosophy, science, art, religion, all the human endeavors that try to make sense of our place in the cosmos. And if the question has no final answer, if the mystery remains, that doesn't diminish the wonder. It might even enhance it. A mystery fully explained ceases to be mysterious. It becomes familiar, ordinary, understood. But a mystery that persists, that deepens the more we explore it, that continues to surprise and challenge us, that remains vibrant and alive. And the question of why there is anything at all is the deepest mystery there is. It's the mystery at the heart of everything, the question that never goes away, no matter how much we learn or how far we progress. So maybe we should embrace the mystery rather than trying to eliminate it. Maybe we should accept that some questions don't have answers, or don't have answers we can grasp, and that this is okay. It's part of the human condition to live with uncertainty, to dwell in mystery, to navigate a reality that we can't fully comprehend. This isn't a counsel of despair. It's a recognition of our limitations and also of our capacities. We're limited in what we can know, but we're capable of asking profound questions, of wondering about deep truths, of sensing the mystery even when we can't solve it. And that capacity for wonder, that openness to mystery, might be as important as any answer we could find. It keeps us humble, keeps us curious, keeps us reaching towards something beyond ourselves. It prevents us from becoming complacent, from thinking we've figured everything out, from closing ourselves off to new possibilities and new insights. The mystery keeps us open, keeps us searching, keeps us alive to the strangeness and wonder of existence. Let's consider the relationship between the observer and the observed, because this might hold a clue to understanding existence. In quantum mechanics, as we've mentioned, the act of observation seems to play a fundamental role in determining what's real. Before you measure a particle's position, it doesn't have a definite position. It exists in a superposition of all possible positions. The measurement brings it into definiteness, collapses the wave function, makes it real in a specific way. This has led some physicists to wonder whether reality depends on observation, whether the universe needs observers to be fully real. This is a strange thought, but it connects to something deep. Without consciousness, without observers, would the universe exist in the same way? Or would it be just a haze of quantum possibilities, never actualizing into concrete events? Some interpretations say yes, consciousness is necessary to collapse wave functions, to make reality definite. Others say no, the collapse happens through physical interactions, no consciousness required. But even in those interpretations, there's something peculiar about measurement and observation. The question becomes even more interesting when we think about the early universe. For billions of years after the Big Bang, there were no observers, no conscious beings, nothing that could measure or observe. Did quantum events have definite outcomes during that time? Or was the universe in some sense less real, more potential than actual, waiting for observers to evolve? Some versions of the participatory anthropic principle suggest that observation works backward in time, that when conscious observers finally appeared, their observations retroactively made the early universe definite and real. This sounds bizarre, but it's a serious proposal by serious physicists. It suggests that the universe needed to produce observers in order to become fully real, that there's a strange loop where the universe creates observers, and observers create the universe by observing it. If this is right, then the question of why there's something rather than nothing might be tied to the question of why there's consciousness. The universe exists because it contains observers, and it contains observers because it exists. It's a self-creating, self-observing system. This brings us to what's called the fine-tuning problem. The universe appears to be finely tuned for the existence of life and consciousness. The fundamental constants of nature, things like the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the cosmological constant, all have very specific values. If any of these values were even slightly different, the universe would be radically different, probably unable to support life. Stars wouldn't form, or they'd burn out too quickly. Atoms wouldn't be stable. Chemistry as we know it wouldn't exist. The fact that all these constants have just the right values to allow for complexity in life is astonishing. It's like finding a radio already tuned to exactly the right frequency to pick up a signal. You could say it's just luck, just chance. But when there are dozens of these constants, and they all need to be in a very narrow range, luck starts to seem insufficient as an explanation. The odds against all of them being right by chance are astronomically small. So how do we explain the fine-tuning? One answer is design. The universe is finely tuned because someone tuned it, a designer, a creator, God. This is the argument from fine-tuning for the existence of God, and it has considerable force. If you found a watch on a beach, you wouldn't assume it assembled itself by chance. you'd infer a watchmaker. Similarly, a finely tuned universe suggests a universe maker. But this argument faces objections. One is that even if fine-tuning implies design, it doesn't tell us much about the designer. It could be a traditional god, or it could be something very different, an alien in a higher dimension running a simulation, or a natural process we don't understand yet. Another objection is the multiverse explanation. If there are countless universes with different values for the constants, then we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in one of the rare universes where the values allow for life. It's selection bias. We could only observe a life-permitting universe because we couldn't exist in any other kind. So the fine-tuning isn't really surprising. It's inevitable given that we're here to observe it. The multiverse explanation is scientifically respectable, arising naturally from theories like eternal inflation and string theory. But it's also philosophically controversial because it's untestable, at least with current technology. We can't observe other universes. We can only infer them from theory. Some people find this unsatisfying. It feels like explaining one mystery, fine-tuning, by invoking a bigger mystery, the multiverse. Why is there a multiverse generating all these different universes? That seems at least as puzzling as why our universe is finely tuned. But defenders of the multiverse argue that it's more economical to posit one mechanism that generates many universes than to posit a designer who fine-tunes one universe. The multiverse explanation uses known physics, quantum mechanics, and inflation. The design explanation requires invoking an entirely new kind of entity, a cosmic designer. From this perspective, the multiverse is the more parsimonious explanation. It multiplies entities in one sense, all those universes, but it doesn't multiply kinds of entities. It uses the same physical principles we already know about. But there's another way to think about fine-tuning that doesn't rely on either design or the multiverse. Maybe the constants aren't really independent. Maybe they're all related to each other in ways we don't yet understand, constrained by deeper principles that require them to have certain values. If there's a theory of everything that unifies all the forces and explains where the constants come from, maybe that theory will show that the constants couldn't have been different. They follow necessarily from the mathematical structure of the theory. In that case, the appearance of fine-tuning would be illusory. The constants seem finely tuned because we don't yet understand the deeper theory that explains them. Once we have that theory, we'll see that they had to be what they are. This would be a satisfying resolution because it would turn fine-tuning into a discovery problem rather than a fundamental mystery. We just need to discover the right theory, and the mystery will dissolve. But even if we found such a theory, we'd still face the question of why that theory rather than some other theory. Why this mathematical structure rather than a different one? Unless the theory is somehow uniquely necessary, uniquely the only logically possible theory, we're back to the same question, and most physicists doubt that the final theory of physics will be logically unique. There seem to be many possible mathematical structures, many possible sets of laws, and physics alone probably can't tell us why this one is actualized. We're left with either accepting it as a brute fact, or appealing to something beyond physics, or invoking the multiverse where all theories are realized somewhere. The circle of explanations closes, and we're back where we started. Every explanation either terminates in a brute fact or points to something that itself requires explanation. It's explanations all the way down until it isn't, and then we hit bedrock, the ultimate given, the thing we can't explain further. Let's think about the concept of being itself, the notion of existence as such. What does it mean for something to exist? This seems like it should have an obvious answer, but it's surprisingly difficult to pin down. Does a number exist? Does a thought exist? Does a possibility exist? These questions show that existence comes in different flavors or modes. A physical object exists in one way. A mathematical entity exists in another way. An abstract concept exists in yet another way. Or maybe we should say that physical objects genuinely exist, and other things exist only in a derivative or secondary sense. This is the view of physicalism or materialism, that the only things that truly exist are physical things, matter and energy in space-time. Everything else, minds, numbers, concepts, is either reducible to physical things or doesn't really exist at all. But physicalism faces challenges. Consciousness seems hard to reduce to pure physics. Mathematical truths seem independent of physical reality. The laws of nature themselves seem to transcend any particular physical configuration. So maybe we need a broader ontology, a more generous account of what exists. Maybe there are multiple categories of being, multiple ways of existing, and physical existence is just one of them. This is ontological pluralism, and it has a long tradition in philosophy. Plato distinguished between the world of forms, eternal and unchanging, and the world of physical things, temporal and changing. Both exist but in different ways. Medieval philosophers distinguished between necessary beings and contingent beings, between substances and accidents, between essence and existence. These distinctions carve up reality in different ways, recognizing that not all existence is the same kind of existence. And if we accept ontological pluralism, then the question of why there is something rather than nothing becomes more complex. We're not just asking why there's physical stuff, we're asking why there's being at all in any of its modes. Why is there this whole landscape of existence, physical and abstract, actual and possible, material and mental? And maybe the answer is that being is more fundamental than non-being, that existence is the default and non-existence is the special case requiring explanation. This inverts our usual intuition. We usually think that nothing is the default, the zero state, and something needs a reason. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe being is primary, and nothingness would require some kind of negation, some active suppression of being. This is close to the view of Spinoza, who identified God with nature, with the totality of being. For Spinoza, existence is necessary and eternal. It couldn't not be. Nothingness is not a real possibility. It's a conceptual abstraction, a way of thinking about absence. But absence always presupposes something that's absent. You can't have pure absence, absence of everything, because then there's no framework within which to define absence. Absence is always absence of something within a larger context that exists. So nothingness as absolute non-being is incoherent, and being is necessary. This is an elegant argument, but it might be too quick. We can conceive of absolute nothingness, or at least we think we can. We can imagine that nothing had ever existed. Maybe we're not really imagining absolute nothingness. Maybe we're imagining ourselves contemplating nothingness, which is still something. But the fact that the thought seems coherent suggests that nothingness might be a genuine possibility, not just a confusion or a linguistic error. And if nothingness is possible, then we're back to wondering why it's not actual, why there's something instead. The question persists, resistant to dissolution. Maybe some questions are like that, too deep to be dissolved by conceptual analysis, too fundamental to be answered by any explanation we can give. They mark the limits of understanding, the boundaries beyond which we can't go. And recognizing those boundaries is itself a kind of wisdom, knowing what we can know and what we can't. There's a concept in theology called divine simplicity, the idea that God is absolutely simple, without parts or complexity. God is not composed of different attributes that could be separated. God's power, knowledge, goodness, existence, all these are identical with each other and with God's essence. God is pure being, pure actuality, with no potential, no incompleteness, no composition. This is hard to grasp because everything we experience is composite, made of parts, complex. But the idea is that God, as the ultimate foundation of reality, must be absolutely simple. If God were composite, we could ask about the parts and how they're related, and we'd have something more fundamental than God. So God must be simple to be ultimate. And if God is pure being, then God's existence is not something God has, like a property or an attribute. God's existence is identical with what God is. God doesn't have existence. God is existence. This is why God necessarily exists, why God can't not exist. To deny God's existence would be to deny being itself, and you can't coherently deny being because the denial itself is something, an act of being. This is profound and subtle, and it's easy to misunderstand. It doesn't mean that God is just an abstract principle or a concept. It means that God is the concrete, actual reality that grounds all other reality. God is being itself, fully actualized, fully real, and everything else exists by participating in God's being, by receiving existence from the source of all existence. This solves the problem of why there's something rather than nothing, by identifying the something with God, who exists necessarily, and deriving everything else from God. But it faces the same challenge we've encountered repeatedly. Even if we grant that there's a necessarily existing simple being, why is there that rather than nothing? The claim of necessary existence seems to just assert what needs to be explained. Unless we can show that necessary existence is truly necessary, that non-existence is impossible, we haven't fully resolved the puzzle. And showing that seems to require a priori metaphysical arguments that many philosophers find unconvincing. Let's shift to thinking about the nature of causation more deeply. We've been assuming that if something exists, it either has a cause or it doesn't. If it has a cause, we can ask about that cause. If it doesn't, it's a brute fact or a necessary being. But maybe this is too simple. Maybe causation is more complex and interesting than we're acknowledging. In Aristotelian philosophy, there are 4 types of causes. The material cause, what something is made of. The formal cause, what form or structure it has. The efficient cause, what brought it into being. And the final cause, what purpose or end it serves. Modern science focuses almost entirely on efficient causation, the chain of events where one thing leads to another. But the other types of causation might be relevant to understanding existence. Maybe the universe has a formal cause, a structure or pattern that it necessarily embodies. Maybe it has a final cause, a purpose or goal that draws it into being. If we only think about efficient causation, we're asking what event or agent caused the universe. But if we think about formal and final causation, we're asking what structure or purpose the universe embodies. And that might be a more fruitful question. The formal cause of the universe might be its mathematical structure, the patterns and relationships that govern how things behave. The final cause might be the production of complexity, consciousness, value, beauty. If the universe exists in order to bring about these goods, then its existence has a teleological explanation, an explanation in terms of goals rather than antecedent causes. This is deeply unfashionable in modern science, which rejects teleology, the idea that nature acts for purposes. But maybe that rejection is premature. Maybe purpose and directionality are real features of the universe, not just human projections. The universe does seem to have a direction, from simple to complex, from uniform to diverse, from energy to structure. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy increases, disorder spreads, but locally, in pockets like our solar system, order increases. Complexity emerges. Life arises. Consciousness appears. There's a kind of creative advance happening, an exploration of possibilities, a building of structure. Maybe this isn't random. Maybe it's the universe actualizing its potential, fulfilling its nature, moving toward ends that are implicit in its structure. This sounds mystical, and maybe it is, but it's not obviously false. It's an alternative way of thinking about why the universe is the way it is. Instead of asking what caused it, we ask what it's for, what it's trying to become, what purpose it serves. And if the answer is that the universe exists to create complexity and consciousness and beauty, then its existence isn't arbitrary or accidental. It's purposeful, meaningful, directed toward valuable ends. This doesn't fully answer why there's a universe with this purpose rather than no universe at all, but it changes the character of the question. It makes existence less puzzling because it gives it meaning. A meaningful existence, one directed toward good ends, seems less in need of explanation than a meaningless existence, a random accident with no purpose. We're more comfortable with purposeful things. We understand actions taken for reasons, for goals. So if the universe is like that, if it exists for a reason, for a purpose, that makes it more comprehensible, even if we can't fully explain where the purpose comes from. Purpose implies something like intentionality, and intentionality is usually associated with minds. Rocks don't have purposes. Only beings with minds have intentions, goals, reasons for acting. So if the universe has a purpose, does that mean the universe has a mind, or that there's a cosmic mind that gives the universe its purpose? This brings us back to the idea of God or cosmic consciousness, a universal mind that intends the existence of the universe and gives it purpose and meaning. But it could also be that purpose is more fundamental than mind, that teleology doesn't require a purposer, that directionality toward goals is a basic feature of reality, not something that needs to be explained in terms of conscious intentions. This is speculative, admittedly. We're reaching beyond what science can currently tell us, into the realm of metaphysical speculation. But that's where we have to go when we ask ultimate questions. Science can tell us how things work, but why they work that way, why there's something for science to study in the first place, these are questions that take us beyond science into philosophy and metaphysics. Let's return to the quantum world for a moment, because quantum mechanics continues to surprise us with its implications. One of the strangest features of quantum mechanics is entanglement. When two particles are entangled, they're connected in such a way that measuring one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. If you measure the spin of one entangled particle and find it's up, the other particle's spin will be down, even if it's on the other side of the galaxy. This happens faster than light could travel between them, which seems to violate relativity. But it doesn't actually allow faster than light communication, so it doesn't contradict relativity. It just shows that the universe is deeply interconnected in ways we don't fully understand. Entangled particles aren't really separate. They're part of a single quantum system, a unified whole, even when they're spatially distant. This suggests that separateness might be an illusion, that at the quantum level, everything is connected, part of an undivided wholeness. If the universe is fundamentally entangled, fundamentally interconnected, then maybe existence isn't a collection of separate things but a unified process, a single reality manifesting in countless forms. This is reminiscent of the mystical idea of unity, the non-dual awareness, where all distinctions dissolve and everything is seen as one. Quantum mechanics might be pointing toward this truth scientifically, showing us that the appearance of separation is a macroscopic illusion, and the reality is entanglement, connection, unity. And if reality is fundamentally one, fundamentally unified, then asking why there's something rather than nothing becomes asking why there's this one unified reality. And maybe the answer is that unity, wholeness, completeness is more fundamental than multiplicity and separation. A complete, unified existence is somehow more natural, more stable, more necessary than non-existence or fragmented existence. This is vague, admittedly, but it gestures toward a way of thinking about existence that's holistic rather than atomistic, that sees reality as an integrated whole rather than a collection of independent parts. This idea of wholeness connects to another fascinating aspect of reality, the relationship between the part and the whole. Every particle in the universe is connected to every other particle through gravitational and electromagnetic fields. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a star billions of years ago. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the oxygen you breathe, all of it came from stellar furnaces, from supernovas that exploded and scattered their contents across space. You are literally made of stardust. Your body is recycled cosmic material, atoms that have been part of countless other structures before becoming part of you. And when you die, those atoms will be released again, returning to the cycle, becoming part of soil and air and water, eventually becoming part of other living things. Nothing is ever truly separate. Everything is borrowing existence from everything else, temporarily taking form before dissolving back into the whole. This perspective changes how we think about existence. We usually think of ourselves as separate individuals, distinct from the world around us. But that's a convenient fiction, a useful way of navigating reality, but not ultimately true. The boundary between you and the environment is fuzzy, permeable, constantly shifting. You breathe in air, and it becomes part of you. You eat food, and it becomes your flesh. You excrete waste, and it returns to the environment. You're not a closed system. You're an open process, a pattern of organization that maintains itself by constantly exchanging matter and energy with the surroundings. The same is true of all living things, and in a different way, of all things, period. Stars consume hydrogen and produce helium and heavier elements. Galaxies exchange matter through gravitational interactions. The whole universe is interconnected, interdependent, a vast web of relationships where nothing exists in isolation. If this is true, if separateness is illusory and everything is connected, then maybe existence itself is not many things but one thing, one unified reality expressing itself in countless forms. The question of why there is something rather than nothing might be better phrased as why there is this one unified existence rather than no existence. And perhaps that question has a different character than the question about why there are many separate things. A unified existence might be more comprehensible, more natural, more necessary than a fragmented existence. Unity might be closer to simplicity, closer to the kind of thing that could exist without needing external explanation. This is abstract, perhaps too abstract, but it's pointing towards something important. The more we learn about reality, the more we discover interconnection, unity, wholeness. And that might be a clue about the fundamental nature of existence. Think about the way patterns repeat at different scales in nature. The branching of trees resembles the branching of rivers, which resembles the branching of blood vessels, which resembles the branching of neural networks. Spiral patterns appear in galaxies, hurricanes, seashells, DNA molecules. The same mathematical structures show up again and again at different levels of reality. This suggests that reality is not arbitrary, not a random collection of unrelated phenomena, but structured, patterned, following deep organizing principles that manifest at every scale. And if reality is deeply patterned, if it embodies mathematical structures and organizing principles, then maybe it exists because those structures and principles are necessary, because they're the way things have to be if they're going to be at all. This brings us back to the mathematical universe idea, but with a different emphasis. It's not just that the universe is mathematical. It's that the universe is patterned, organized, coherent, and that coherence might be self-sustaining, self-explaining. A coherent, patterned, organized reality might be stable in a way that an incoherent, chaotic, disorganized reality wouldn't be. Maybe the question isn't why there's something rather than nothing, but why there's order rather than chaos. And the answer might be that order is stable and self-maintaining, while chaos is unstable and self-destroying. Order creates structure, and structure persists. Chaos creates nothing, and nothing is nothing. So perhaps existence naturally takes the form of ordered something rather than chaotic nothing. This is speculative, of course. We're reaching for principles that might make sense of existence, trying different angles, different perspectives. None of them is fully satisfying. None of them completely dissolves the mystery. But each one offers a glimpse, a partial insight, a way of thinking that illuminates some aspect of the question. Let's consider one more perspective before we bring this exploration to a close. This is the idea that existence might be self-causing, that reality creates itself in a kind of loop. This sounds paradoxical. How can something cause itself? How can something exist before it exists in order to bring itself into existence? But some physicists and philosophers have taken this idea seriously. In quantum mechanics, as we've discussed, the future can influence the past. Observations made now can affect what happened earlier. So maybe there's a causal loop at the foundation of reality where the universe brings itself into existence by a kind of backward causation. The universe exists now, and that present existence reaches back to cause its own beginning. This is mind-bending, and it might not even be coherent, but it's an attempt to solve the problem of the first cause by making the chain of causes circular rather than linear. Instead of an infinite regress of causes or a first uncaused cause, you have a loop, a self-creating system. John Wheeler, the physicist we mentioned earlier, proposed something like this with his participatory universe idea. The universe creates observers, observers observe the universe, and those observations bring the universe into being retroactively. It's a self-creating loop where the present explains the past by making the past definite through observation. This might sound like science fiction, but it's grounded in real quantum mechanics, in the genuine strangeness of how observation and reality interact at the quantum level. If Wheeler is right, then the universe doesn't have a beginning in the usual sense. It has a self-creating loop where existence and observation mutually support each other in a timeless, circular way. And if the universe is self-creating, then asking why it exists might be like asking why a circle is round. It's self-creating by its very nature. That's what it is. The question dissolves not because we've found an external explanation, but because we've recognized that the universe is its own explanation, self-grounding, self-sustaining, self-creating. This brings us to perhaps the deepest insight we can reach. Maybe existence doesn't need an explanation external to itself. Maybe existence is self-explanatory, not in the sense that we can fully understand it, but in the sense that it contains its own reason for being within itself. Reality is because reality is. Being is because being is. This sounds tautological, empty, but maybe it's the deepest truth available. Maybe at the ultimate foundation, explanation gives out, and we're left with simple being, simple isness, the brute fact of existence that grounds everything else. And maybe that's not a failure of explanation, but the recognition that explanation has limits, that at some point we reach bedrock, the given, the foundation that simply is, without needing to be explained in terms of something more fundamental. If we accept this, if we rest in this recognition, then the question of why there is something rather than nothing doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes less a question demanding an answer, and more an expression of wonder, of amazement, of awe at the sheer fact of existence. We're here. The universe is here. Stars are shining, planets are orbiting, life is flourishing, consciousness is awakening to itself. And that's astonishing. That's miraculous, not in the sense of violating natural laws, but in the sense of being wonderful beyond measure. Every moment of existence is a gift, undeserved, unexplained, simply given. We didn't earn the right to exist. We didn't bring ourselves into being. We found ourselves here, in the midst of reality, part of the cosmic dance, temporary expressions of the universe's creativity and abundance. When you think about it this way, the question transforms from a philosophical puzzle into a spiritual mystery, into something that evokes gratitude rather than confusion, wonder rather than frustration. We don't need to solve the mystery. We can live within it, celebrate it, participate in it. The universe exists, and we exist as part of the universe, conscious witnesses to the great mystery of being. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question doesn't need answering. Perhaps the wonder is the point. Because in wondering, we participate in something profound. We acknowledge that existence is not ordinary, not mundane, not to be taken for granted. We recognize the strangeness, the unlikeliness, the sheer astonishing fact that there is something rather than nothing, that we are here to notice it, to think about it, to feel the weight of the mystery. Through this long exploration, we've considered so many perspectives. We've looked at scientific theories about quantum fluctuations and multiverses and eternal inflation. We've examined philosophical arguments about necessary beings and sufficient reason and brute facts. We've explored theological ideas about God as creator and sustainer. We've touched on mystical insights about non-duality and the unity of all things. We've thought about mathematics and logic and consciousness and time and infinity and causation and purpose. Each perspective has shed some light, revealed some facet of the mystery, but none has fully explained it. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the ultimate question about existence is meant to remain mysterious, meant to stay just beyond our grasp, a horizon that recedes as we approach it. The ancient philosophers knew this. They recognized that there are limits to human understanding, that some questions lead us to the edge of what we can know, and at that edge, different traditions responded differently. Some, like the Greek skeptics, counseled suspension of judgment, accepting that we can't know the ultimate answers and finding peace in that acceptance. Others, like the Neoplatonists, spoke of a mystical union with the One, the ultimate reality beyond all concepts and categories, accessible not through reason but through direct experience. Still others, like the Stoics, found meaning in accepting the nature of reality as it is, living in harmony with the cosmos without needing to fully understand it. And the wisdom traditions of the East, Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism, often pointed toward a truth beyond words, beyond concepts, accessible only through meditation, contemplation, the quieting of the mind's endless questioning. All these approaches have value. All of them recognize that there's something about reality that exceeds our conceptual grasp, that the ultimate nature of existence is mysterious in a way that demands humility, openness, willingness to not know. This doesn't mean abandoning the quest for understanding. Science and philosophy should continue to probe, to question, to seek explanations. We should keep asking why, keep pushing at the boundaries of knowledge. But we should also recognize that some questions might not have answers we can articulate, that mystery is a permanent feature of our relationship with reality, not a temporary gap in knowledge waiting to be filled. The question of why there is something rather than nothing might be that kind of question, the ultimate mystery that grounds all other mysteries, the one question that has no answer, because it is itself the foundation of all questions and answers. And there's a kind of peace in accepting this. The restless search for an ultimate answer can give way to restful dwelling in the question. We don't need to solve the mystery to appreciate it. We don't need to explain existence to be grateful for it. We can simply be here, present to the miracle of the moment, aware that we are participating in something vast and strange and wonderful. Every breath you take is an affirmation of existence. Every sensation, every thought, every moment of awareness is the universe experiencing itself, knowing itself, delighting in itself. You are not separate from this process. You are it. You are existence becoming aware of existence, being contemplating being, the cosmos looking at itself through your eyes and wondering why it is. This wondering is itself part of the beauty of existence. The universe is not just physical stuff moving according to laws, it's also meaning, value, awareness, the capacity to know and wonder and love. And these things, consciousness and wonder and the search for meaning, might be just as fundamental as matter and energy. Maybe the universe exists in order to know itself, to experience itself, to create beauty and meaning and value. Maybe the ultimate why is because consciousness and experience and meaning are good, and existence is the manifestation of that goodness. This is the Platonic vision we touched on earlier, the idea that the good draws things into being, that existence is the expression of value. And if that's true, then we don't need to search outside existence for an explanation. The explanation is woven into the fabric of existence itself. Being is valuable, consciousness is valuable, experience is valuable, and the universe exists because existence is better than non-existence, because being is good. You might disagree with this. You might think that existence is not obviously good, that there's too much suffering, too much pain, too much that seems wrong with the world to call existence good without qualification. And that's a valid response. The problem of evil, the question of why there's suffering if existence is good, is one of the oldest and deepest philosophical and theological problems. We haven't addressed it directly in this exploration, but it's intimately connected to our question. If we're wondering why there's something rather than nothing, we might also wonder why there's this particular something, with all its beauty and horror, joy and suffering, creation and destruction. The universe is not unambiguously good. It's complex, mixed, containing both wonderful and terrible things. And that complexity might be part of the answer. Maybe a universe that's all good and no bad, all pleasure and no pain, all harmony and no conflict, wouldn't be as rich, as deep, as meaningful as a universe that contains contrasts, struggles, the full range of possibilities. This doesn't make suffering good or justify evil, but it suggests that a rich, complex, meaningful existence might necessarily include things we'd rather not have, that the fullness of being requires the possibility of both good and bad, both creation and destruction, both life and death. This is difficult territory, and we should tread carefully. We don't want to minimize real suffering by appealing to abstract metaphysical principles, but we're asking the ultimate questions here, trying to understand existence at the deepest level, and that requires considering all aspects of existence, not just the pleasant ones. The universe contains both stars being born and stars dying, both species evolving and species going extinct, both love and loss, both joy and sorrow. And all of it is part of existence, part of the great cosmic process that we're trying to understand. Perhaps the question of why there is something rather than nothing is ultimately answered by simply being present to what is, by opening ourselves to the fullness of existence in all its complexity. The answer isn't a formula or an argument or a theory. It's an experience, a recognition, a moment of clarity, where the question dissolves, not because we've solved it intellectually, but because we've seen through it to something deeper. We realize that existence is its own justification, that being is self-evident, that the question only arises when we step back from direct experience and try to conceptualize reality from outside. But we can't step outside reality. We're always within it, always part of it, always expressions of it. And from within, the question doesn't arise in the same way. There's just this moment, this breath, this awareness, this being here now. The mystics and sages who speak of enlightenment or awakening or realization often describe it in these terms. A shift from questioning to being, from seeking to finding, from confusion to clarity. Not because all questions are answered, but because the need for answers falls away. Reality is simply accepted as it is, in its fullness, without resistance, without the demand that it be different or make sense in a particular way. This is sometimes called acceptance, sometimes surrender, sometimes just presence. It's the recognition that we are not separate from existence trying to understand it from outside. We are existence understanding itself from within. And when we realize this, when we truly see it, the question of why there is something rather than nothing is seen for what it is, a product of the illusion of separation, the false sense that we stand apart from reality looking at it rather than being it. This doesn't mean the question was meaningless or that exploring it was a waste. The journey through the question has value even if we don't reach a final answer. We've thought deeply about existence, about reality, about the nature of being. We've considered perspectives from science, philosophy, theology, mysticism. We've stretched our minds, challenged our assumptions, opened ourselves to wonder and mystery. And in doing so, we've participated more fully in existence. We've become more conscious, more aware, more awake to the miracle of being here. And that participation, that awakening, might be the purpose of the question all along. Not to find an answer, but to deepen our relationship with existence, to move from taking it for granted to marveling at it, from sleepwalking through life to being fully present, to the astonishing fact that anything is at all. As we bring this exploration to a close, as these thoughts wind down and you drift toward sleep, let yourself rest in the mystery. You don't need to understand why you exist. You don't need to solve the ultimate puzzle. You can simply be here, breathing, aware, present. The universe is vast beyond measure, old beyond imagining, complex beyond comprehension. And yet here you are, a small part of it, a brief moment of consciousness in the cosmic flow. Your existence is improbable, unlikely, miraculous. And it's also natural, inevitable, simply what is. Both perspectives are true. You are both infinitely small and infinitely significant, both a fleeting accident and a necessary expression of the universe's nature. Hold both truths lightly. Don't try to resolve the paradox. Just let it be. Tomorrow you'll wake and return to the world of ordinary concerns, of tasks and responsibilities, of the daily flow of life. And that's good. That's part of being here, part of participating in existence. But tonight, in this quiet moment, you've touched something deeper. You've asked the ultimate question and found that it doesn't have an answer you can put into words. And that's all right. The question has done its work. It's opened you to wonder, reminded you that existence is strange and marvelous and mysterious. Carry that sense of wonder with you. Let it color your days, deepen your experiences, make the ordinary extraordinary. Because everything is extraordinary when you really look at it. Every moment is a miracle when you realize it didn't have to be, that there could have been nothing at all, but instead there's this, there's here, there's now, there's you. Rest now in that realization. Let the question dissolve into peaceful acceptance. Let your thoughts slow and quiet. The universe is here. You are here. And that's enough. That's everything. The mystery remains, will always remain, and that's beautiful. Sleep now, part of the great cosmic process, a wave in the ocean of being, temporary and eternal, small and infinite, separate and unified. You are the universe dreaming itself into existence, consciousness awakening to itself, being knowing being. And in this knowing, in this awareness, the question of why there is something rather than nothing finds not an answer, but a resolution, a peace, a deep okayness with what is. The stars are still shining, the galaxies still turning, the quantum field still humming with potential. All of it exists, all of it is, and you are part of it all. Rest in that knowledge. Rest in that belonging. Rest in existence itself, mysterious and beautiful and utterly, completely here. Sleep comes now, gentle and natural, a temporary return to the void, a small death that prefigures the larger one, but also a restoration, a renewal, a preparation for tomorrow's return to being. And even in sleep, you exist. Even in unconsciousness, you are. The universe continues its dance, and you continue with it, always held, always home, always part of the one great existence that needs no explanation beyond itself. So rest now, let go of the questions, let go of the search, let existence simply be what it is, and let yourself be what you are, a small, precious, temporary, eternal expression of the great mystery. You are here because you are. The universe is here because it is. And that simple fact, that simple isness, is the deepest truth, the final word, the ultimate answer that needs no words. Be, just be, and in being, rest. Good night.